Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we
I'm
can.
back.
Hello.
Okay, well, I think
Morning.
we're getting ready to go. Who's the first one up?
I think I'm the one presenting.
Okay,
And okay, should I test the screen?
you can share your slides now.
All right.
I can
Okay.
see them.
Is that working? Okay, perfect.
Looks good. And everything is being recorded right now, just to let you know.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So should I just get started?
Feel free to start right now.
Okay. All right. I'm just gonna jump in then. All right, and cool. Thank you everyone for being here early in the morning. I know it's pretty early in the West Coast. So my name is Eddie Ning. I'm a marketing AP from Cheung Kong Graduate School of Business. So this work is jointly done with the two of my colleagues, Henry and Valhon, and also Leah from Maryland. So this paper, we're going to think about two things essentially. The first theme is about competition, and the second theme is about a comparison between two types of recommendation algorithms. So let me first set the stage about what we're talking about here. So the context in which we're thinking about this paper is content recommendations. So think about YouTube, TikTok, Netflix, Instagram, etc. So in all of these platforms, right, our feeds are all personalized. What you see is different from mine. But more importantly, right, what we see is actually a result of what the platform's recommendation algorithm choose for us, right? So that these algorithms make recommendations based on the prediction about what we're gonna like next from our past behaviors on this platform, and this is also very adaptive type of personalization, where every time you tap and swipe on the app, it's actually being recorded as a feedback that's going to change what you see in the future, right? So this is content recommendation. This is where we're thinking about this recommendation problems, not let's say in a e-commerce type, Amazon recommendation type. That's a slightly different context than what we're thinking about here. So if you're thinking about this recommendation problem, so one framework under which you can think about this recommendation problem is a multi-armed bandit problem. So if you think about the, let's say the following example where you have an individual consumer that goes to an app and repeatedly at each time, and the app has different choice. The app can recommend different type of content, right? So different people like different type of niche content that represent different interests. Right, you can also recommend something that's more mass market where everybody sort of like it, but you don't learn so much about their individual preferences. And so a consumer is going to go there. Firm has to choose which type of content to recommend, and then the firm observe whether the consumer actually likes it, and then update belief about how much consumer like each type of content, and then use that updated belief to make another recommendation and again, right? So this is from the firm point of view. From the firm point of view, this is a multi-armed bandit problem. So what we're thinking about as a recommendation algorithm here is just a mapping, right? So first of all, this is an analytical paper, right? So the way we're thinking about recommendation algorithm here is a mapping from the information you have about individual consumer, which is here is the IT. This is at time T, all the past user behavior you recorded, which included all the content that you recommended to that consumer in the past and the outcome of those recommendations, right? Did the consumer actually like it or not? And you map each information set to a content choice, right? About what to recommend next. So this mapping, any mapping here, we're calling it a recommendation algorithm, but we're going to focus on two more specifically in a moment. All right. So if you think about this as a multi-armed bandit problem, then a central trade-off in a multi-armed bandit problem is this exploration versus exploitation problem, where exploit means that I use I can use all the information I have up to this point, but I'm only trying to make the best decision next. I just care about one decision, right? To maximize my immediate payoff, right? So I just make the best recommendation to you next that you most likely to enjoy without really caring about the future. Exploration is something a little different. Maybe I don't recommend something to you right now that given all I know about you, is probably the best recommendation for now. Instead, I give you something else that maybe let me collect a little more information about your preferences. So this is trading off of immediate payoff for better information for the future, right? So this is a more forward-looking problem. And so now, if you think about the following recommendation strategy. So suppose on the background, we can be a little bit agnostic about how this is done, but right on the background, you have something that calculates or predict the probability a consumer is going to like each piece of content as a function of the features of the content and the user profile, right? So this is somehow done. And then your recommendation strategy is just the following. I'm going to just rank it and take the highest, right? Just pick the most piece of content that a consumer, given what I know about him, is most likely to like. And so this type of strategy is all about exploitation, right? So no concern about future decisions, no concern about the information I collect from this decision that I make. So it's all about exploitation and no exploration. And so for that reason, we're going to call something like this myopic, right? Myopic as in not forward-looking. And so you can contrast that with the forward-looking algorithm, which if it's the optimal forward-looking algorithm, that means it's going to have to balance this trade-off between exploitation and exploration, right? And this and it's not free to go from the myopic algorithm to the forward-looking algorithm, so we can think of it as a form of technological upgrade. So our interest will be centered in this paper actually around both the incentive for firm to adopt this upgrade and the effect this upgrade is going to have on user welfare, on what type of content user ended up seeing. Just for motivation, we can also map these what we call myopic and forward-looking algorithm here to more real life scenarios. So if you think about, for example, the more basic type of recommendation system now, content-based or user-based filtering, or even deep learning-based. So all of these supervised learning-based recommendation algorithms, what they do conceptually is very similar to what I described earlier, where I'm trying to make a prediction about the probability consumer is going to like something using all the information I have right now. But in making that prediction, right, there's no explicit concern about what information I'm collecting from this recommendation, how that affects my future decision, etc. Right, so these supervised learning-based algorithms are inherently myopic. Whereas in the last couple of years, big firms have all been pushing, trying to use more reinforcement learning or bandit type of recommender systems. Now, I don't know exactly, right, what's in the what exactly algorithm these firms are using. It's more of a black box to outsiders, but at least you can find some papers where these firms are the scientists from these firms are talking about their effort in this area. And there's actually some very nicely some YouTube videos. So this is a video by YouTube scientists uploaded on YouTube talking about using reinforcement learning for recommender system, and part of this the limitation of supervised learning is that it makes myopic recommendations. Here is a presentation by Netflix scientists talking about using multi-arm bandit for recommendations to balance this trade-off with exploration. Right, so this is something that's more ongoing. Right, we know that algorithms today can't be called optimal yet. Right, but this is a progress to which we're moving away from myopic and towards a more optimal forward-looking algorithm. So this is the technological upgrade that's happening right now. So this paper we're essentially fill out the table and consider a 2x2 scenario where we're going to think about both a monopoly and a duopoly. So we're adding competition into the multi-armed bandit problem, but also thinking about this technological upgrade from myopic algorithm and the forward-looking algorithm. And essentially, if you analyze these four scenarios, then by comparing them, there's actually quite a couple different interesting things you can do here. For example, if I compare what the forward-looking algorithm look like under monopoly and under duopoly, what that answers is essentially the question in our title: how does competition affect the exploration versus exploitation trade-off, right? So if the optimal algorithm behave differently, whether there's competition or not, right? That's telling us how this trade-off changes, the optimal trade-off changes when there is a competition. And so if you compare horizontally, right, this is telling you, if I look at for monopoly, the value, my return from a forward-looking algorithm versus the return from a myopic algorithm, the comparison of that is telling me essentially the incentive for a monopoly to invest in this technological upgrade if it's not free. And similarly, I can compare the incentives for the firms to adopt the forward-looking algorithm under competition. And a comparison to that between these two incentives is telling me how the competition actually changes firms' incentive to invest in this technology. So there's by cross-comparing these four cases, we could we analyze the question, which I'm going to summarize in a few slides. So, but adding this competition here is actually not trivial. So when we talk about multi-armed bandit problem before, we're really thinking about monopoly problem, right? So back to here, this is a single firm's problem about what to recommend at each moment for the consumer. So this is a monopolies problem. Now, if we add competition here, all of a sudden, it's not two bandit problem, it's actually three. So here's an illustration, right? Think about the consumer's decision with firm one. Consumers are going to go to firm one make recommendations. So if you just think about that relationship, right, that's firm one's bandit problem. Okay, if you think about consumer going to firm two and firm two making recommendations, so on and so forth, that's bandit problem for firm two. But if you join them together, now all of a sudden, you also have a multi-homing problem for the consumers, because the consumer at each moment is also choosing whether I can go to firm one or firm two, right? So we're all each one of us is on multiple apps, but we can only on one app at the single moment, right? So I'm going to YouTube for some time, and then I jump to TikTok for some other time, and back and forth. So now the consumer problem is also a bandit type of problem too. I'm going to have uncertainty about the utility I'm going to get from each app. So I'm also updating my belief about my utility from going to each app over time, and that's going to change me where I'm going. So I'm jumping back and forth between these apps, overlaying on top of the existing bandit problem that the firm is facing about what to recommend to me had this consumer come to the platform. And so this is a three bandit type of problem overlaid together, and then they're dependent on each other, right? So for a firm, what to recommend, I have to take into consideration what the other firm's recommendation algorithm does, and also what the consumer's behavior is going between these platforms. And so I have to consider the other two people's strategy in determining my own recommendation. And of course, consumers' decision depend on what app to go to, also is affected by what the firms offer. And there's also a solution we're going to look for in this paper is going to solve all three players' bandit problems simultaneously. So I'm making the optimal solution conditional on the other two players' strategy. You can also think about this. I think so if you don't like to think about this as a bandit problem, right, you can also think about this just from the point of view of the consumer. This is a multi-homing problem, right? Behavior where what the firm offer are actually strategic and changes over time, right? So consumer is not only multi-homing, but what I actually get from firm one and firm two is changes over time based on firm's decision. So this is also, you can also think about that as that type of problem, which is also very interesting to think about. So again, we're going to do repeated game where consumers is going to go on forever. Sometime go for firm 1, sometime go for firm 2. So the research questions, we actually, this is just repeating what I said 2 slides before about the 2x2 matrix. We're going to think about how adding this competition is going to affect mainly 3 things. One is what's going to happen to the optimal exploration exploitation trade-off. So how the algorithm actually looks different. Second is what does that happen to firms' incentive to invest in this upgrade from the myopic to the forward-looking algorithm, right? And the third one is how does that upgrade from the myopic to the forward-looking algorithm affect user welfare, and we're gonna compare that under monopoly and under duopoly. And so here is a summary of the main results, just qualitatively. And so the results we get are sharpest when users are impatient. So what we mean by impatient here is just the user have a high discount rate compared to the firms. So users look more impatient than the firms, so they have different time preferences. In this case, so answer the 3 questions we posed 1 slide earlier. Well, how does competition affect the optimal level of exploration versus exploitation? It turned out that in competition decreases the optimal level of exploration. So the optimal algorithm in competition is actually going to look more myopic than what the optimal algorithm looked like under monopoly. And as a result of that, what's going to happen is that the industry return, so not just individual firms return, but the industry return from upgrading, from this upgrade from myopic to forward-looking is actually going to be decreased under duopoly than under monopoly. So jointly, if both firms have forward-looking algorithm compared to both firms having myopic, the return of that is actually going to be lower under monopoly than under duopoly than under monopoly. But the effect on the user welfare is actually the other way around, where under monopoly, that upgrade can actually be bad for consumer, negative on consumer welfare, where it's a positive under duopoly. So competition is better for consumer welfare derived from this technology, even though firms are deriving less value from this technology. So this is an interesting cross between competition, innovation incentives, and welfare. So it actually sounds like there's a little bad story for consumer here, right? So under monopoly, the firm really have higher incentive to invest in this upgrade, even though this upgrade is bad for consumer. Under duopoly, this upgrade would be good for consumer, but firms actually have lower incentive. So even industry as a whole have a lower return from this technology. So a key intuition that's actually driving all of these results is that when firms have to compete for attention of consumers, and if consumers are less patient than firms, consumer have a higher discount rate than firms, then there's actually less room for experimentation. So firms are forced to make more myopic recommendations in the attempt to keep the consumer on my platform longer. And so that's going to result in this lower optimal of exploration, which is going to cause the other 2 effects. So for literature review, we actually have a pretty long literature review section in the paper. Right now, there are a lot of strands of literature we actually relate this to, but for the talk, I'm actually just going to focus on a more narrow range. So there are a lot of papers looking at multi-arm bandit problems, but extended beyond just a single player. But most of these papers involving multiple players are not expanding in the same sense we're having here, right? For example, some of this paper is thinking about you have as a consumer, right, for example, I have a multi-arm bandit problem in choosing between different firms, and each firm is competing for my choice of that arm by setting price, for example. That's very different from what we're doing here, which is you have two firms. Each firm is choosing a bandit type of problem and choosing what to recommend to the consumer. And you're using that bandit, right, to compete for a user's choice. And user's choice itself is also a bandit. So the closest that comes to our model is actually this paper by Arador, Mansour, Slipkins, and Wool, in which they also have two firms that's doing a bandit type of decision in competition for the user to visit. But the key difference here, so I'm just going to focus on this one. The key difference between our paper and that one is there are actually quite a number of differences, but the biggest one is we're thinking about a long-living consumer that's making strategic choices, where they're looking at a sequence of short-lived consumers. So what that results in is, first of all, in the extreme case in which, let's say in our example, in our model, we said we make the consumer's discount rate go to infinity, so consumer become myopic, then our paper's results actually converges. But in the case where consumer are not fully myopic, then what we having a long-lived consumer allow us to think about this multi-homing problem, where the consumer is choosing between where to go over time. Whereas if you have a sequence of short-lived consumer, essentially it's not a multi-homing problem anymore, right? So each consumer only make one choice. So you have some consumer go to one firm, some consumer go to the other firm. So the consumer dynamic decision is missing there. So that's the biggest difference there, although there's actually quite a number of differences in the paper. Another literature, which is actually surprisingly thin, is actually on product personalization. So there's a more working paper right now, but in terms of publication, there's Jun has a paper on product personalization, but there's actually a very thin here, in which thinking about this idea about the firm is offering different product for different consumers, and which is really today is made possible right now with the recommendation algorithms, right? So we're all experiencing, we'll go to the same app, but we're actually experiencing very different things. So it really relates to that literature. So that's a very brief literature review. Let me go into, so the plan here today is I'm going to go into the monopoly model first, explain what it is, just so that we can build up next the duopoly model. We actually do a lot of analysis on the monopoly model, which I'm going to skip mostly. So we're going to set up the monopoly model and then jump directly to a duopoly model. And because that's where the most interesting things are, and we have a restricted time. So that's where we're going to focus on. So monopoly model. So how does it work? So you only have one firm, right? So the consumer is going to this firm every time. And every time the consumer arrives, a firm have three choices. So three content types. I can recommend a niche content, which divide into two types, 1 and 2, and also a mass content, mass market content. If I recommend a niche content to the consumer, depending on the type I recommend, right? So if consumer likes niche 1 over niche 2, that means the probability that the user is going to like that specific content that I recommend is alpha if I recommend the niche 1, the correct type, 1 minus alpha if I recommend niche 2, the incorrect type, right? Where alpha is greater than 1/2. So you're more consumer who generally prefer 1 over 2 is more likely to like a specific niche 1 content versus a niche 2 content. And vice versa for niche 2 over niche 1. Problem for the firm is I don't know which one you are, right? I don't know if you are here or if you're there. If the firm instead recommend mass market content, here the assumption is everybody likes it with the same probability, right? So there's some probability C that consumer is going to like that specific mass market content, which does not differentiate between, there's no heterogeneity between two types of consumer. So what that does is, and firm observe. So this assumption is the firm observe whether the user likes the recommended content. So that's the feedback. So here is, we're capturing this exploitation trade-off in its bare bone minimum form, right? So if you think about, as the firm, I know nothing about a consumer at the beginning, then I get more profit. I can get more profit by recommending you a mass market content, but I get less information, actually no information in this case, right? Because I does not gain anything about whether you are 1 or you're 2. So this trade-off about when to recommend niche versus when to recommend mass, especially when I have a very high level of uncertainty about what you are, that's where we capture this exploration versus exploitation trade-off. So the initial firm has some initial information, right? So the prior is that I times 0. So the firm is going to get a signal about users' preferred content type with some accuracy lambda 0. So lambda 0 is essentially the prior, right? The prior that you are, let's say type 1. And then I'm going to update that prior over time by looking at your response to the content that I recommend to you. Firm objective here is actually quite simple. We are ignoring any type of pricing, advertising type of decision here. So here, firm's objective is just to maximize the total discounted number of likes. So I just care about make as many successful recommendations as possible. So this is equivalent to thinking about a sort of fixed monetization type of problem where every time I recommend something you like, maybe I collect the fixed amount from advertising that's being shown to you along the time. But there's no strategic decision about, let's say, the pricing I charge or how much advertisement I showed, etc. Right? So we're not thinking about a pricing or pseudo pricing type of problem. Firm is just trying to maximize the total discounted number of likes that I can give it to you.
Hey, Eddie.
Is there a question?
Yes, it's Jason. Nice to see you. I have a quick question about the previous slide.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you also consider the possibility where if I'm recommended if I receive a bad recommendation, I'm less likely to visit the firm in the future. Is that baked into the model?
Yes, but not yet. So that's actually a great point, in which so the assumption with a monopoly here is a very strict sense where the consumer don't have a second choice, right? So the consumer is going to be here every moment. So in this strict sense of monopoly, consumer doesn't have that choice of going somewhere else. So that's not here. That's going to come in when there's a duopoly case in which consumer does have a choice of going somewhere else if I get bad recommendations from a firm, and that's actually going to be the main driver of the effect, right? So that's going to be in a duopoly model. That choice is going to be there, and exactly that's going to be what happens because consumer is also learning. So if I get some bad recommendations, I'm learning. What I'm learning is you're probably guessing me wrong, right? So you have a pretty bad prediction about what I have right now. So maybe I could try somewhere else.
Gotcha.
So let's wrap up the monopoly model. Well, so I'm describing everything here in a discrete time sense, right? But in practice, we're gonna do a continuous time version of this thing. So what it does is, so we have a capital Y. This is the essentially cumulative number of likes. So so in discrete time, when T is large, the expectation and the variance of that cumulative likes follows this form. I won't go into too much detail. So we do a continuous time version where we capture the same expected value and the same variance in continuous time form. And the firm is going to update lambda. Lambda is the belief here. So we're going to normalize lambda just here to the belief that the consumer likes type 1 versus type 2. And the firm is going to update that over time. And so without going too much into the math, but you can see different components here. So here, YST, this is the true probability of user like something, which the firm doesn't know because I don't know your type. This is the expectation of the probability you like something given my understanding of you right now. So this composes the new information essentially, right, from the feedbacks. And then the speed at which I'm updating to that new information here is lower as lambda goes towards 0 or 1. So the more I know about you, I update slower, right? That makes sense. And also for alpha, which in this model is greater than 1/2, this is increasing in alpha. The expression alpha is increasing in alpha. So the higher the alpha, the faster I'm going to learn, right? So high alpha means that a consumer have a strong preference, right? So high alpha means if I like type 1, my response to type 1, type 2 are very different. So firm is going to learn more information from niche content. A low alpha means I'm reacting to 1 and 2 pretty similarly, so there's less information. You're going to update slower. So this is what it's going to look like, pretty intuitive. The algorithm is going to be marked essentially by a threshold. So a symmetric, two symmetric thresholds. So in the middle of these thresholds, I'm going to recommend you mass market content. Outside of these thresholds, I'm going to recommend you niche market content. So lambda here is going from 0 to 1. And the myopic algorithm is going to look similar. It just have a higher threshold. So myopic algorithm in general recommend more compared to what's optimal, recommend too much mass market content. And this phenomenon, I think in the recommendation algorithm world, I think they call this popularity bias. So things that are generally more popular get recommended more. So this is essentially what's an illustration of that as well. Okay, so we do a lot of analysis with the monopoly case, but we're going to skip that, directly go to the duopoly case. So in the duopoly case, what happened is the following. Here, at time 0, each firm is going to simultaneously choose a recommendation algorithm. So again, what we mean by recommendation algorithm is just this mapping. So at time 0, I choose any kind of function that maps information, any information set about a consumer to a choice of content. So either niche or mass. There are actually 2 types of niche content, but it's pretty obvious that you want to choose the one that you believe the consumer is, right? So you can ignore the other one for now. So the choice is just niche or mass. And the information you have at any point include all the content you recommended to the consumer in the past when it visit, whether the consumer liked it in the past. And D here is a indicator of whether the consumer was actually on your platform, right, in the past. So this is when they visited, what did I recommend, and did they like it, what I recommended when they visited. So this is a information set about a consumer. So this is recommendation algorithm is mapping from this I to N and N. And once this, after time 0, right, the firm simultaneous choose recommendation algorithm, it's set there. Then at each time T, consumer is going to choose to visit firm 1 and firm 2. Right? So the consumer can jump back and forth. And if I go to firm 2, firm 1 doesn't observe anything. So all I know is consumer is not coming to me. I don't know what's shown to the consumer by the other firm. I don't know if the consumer likes it. None of that, right? So I got no information. So here are actually a very important assumption that need to be there for this thing to work. So the assumption is user does not observe the type of the niche. So it can be either, so it can be done in 2 ways, which are equivalent. So you can assume that the user does not observe the user's own type. So I don't know if I am niche 1 and niche 2 either, but I can observe I know the structure of the game, but I don't know if I'm niche 1 and niche 2. Or you can alternatively assume that I know my niche type, 1 or 2, but when the firm recommends a niche type of content, I don't observe whether that content type is 1 or 2. So all I got is the utility from it. This assumption is actually really important to prevent unraveling, because otherwise consumer knows everything immediately, and through action, everybody knows everything. So there's an immediate unraveling, right? For example, a consumer, the following consumer behavior, right? I know that I like type 1. I visit firm 1. If the firm 1 recommend me niche 1 immediately, then I'm going to return. I'm going to stay. If firm 1 gives the wrong one, type 2, then I'm going to leave. Right? That means essentially immediately the firm 1 now knows whether I am type 1 and type 2. Right? So the information is, and then next period firm 2 knows if I'm for type 1, type 2. So there's an immediate unraveling. There's no learning essentially going on. So so that means some type of this type of assumption needs to be there where the user does not observe either my own type or the type of the niche content. So all I know is you're recommending you niche or mass, but I exactly observe the type. I only observe the utility, whether I actually like it, and I can infer from that. The second assumption is that the preference is it's a less strong assumption. Here, just that preference are independent across firms. Essentially, they're what I call type 1 and type 2 are different for firm 1 and firm 2, right? So it just means that there are more than 2 types of content essentially. So the consumer expected utility is just my discounted number of likes over time. So the first expression is the likes, the number of content that I like when I'm going to firm 1, the number of likes I get over time on firm 2. Each firm's profit is just the discounted number of likes, right? I get when consumer visit me, right? Not the opponent. A key thing here is we allow the user to have a different discount rate than the firm, right? So their time preference can be different. And in general, we're going to focus on a case where users are less patient, so a higher discount factor than the firm. So users are less patient than the firm.
Hey, Eddie. Yeah, just one more question. So your first assumption, does that mean consumers also have incentive to learn their types?
Yes.
Okay.
Coming here. Thank you. Yeah, what does the user learn? Yeah, each firm J endows again with a prior signal. So you have some prior that may be inaccurate, but what the user learn here, right? So the user through firm learns basically the same way as before. What a consumer learns is because the consumer gets now essentially symmetric information with the firm that I'm visiting, right? So I know if I like a particular recommendation or not, and the firm knows that, right? So the consumer has two things. One is my belief at firm J for firm 1 and my belief on firm J at firm 2. So we have 2 lambdas. These lambda are the same as the firm's lambda, but with a different meaning. The firm's belief is essentially, right, I believe you are a type 1, right? That's my belief lambda, that the probability you're a type 1. For the user, if I don't observe the content types, for example, this is just the probability. The interpretation here is the probability that the firm J's niche recommendation, the next niche recommendation, is going to be the correct type, right? Because I don't observe the type specifically, but I know the structure of the game, so I have the expectation about it. This is essentially capturing the quality of the niche content you would recommend, whether it's correct or not. That's the lambda. So consumer can be agnostic about what you call 1 or 2. It's just whether it's matching with my type. So that simplifies things a lot, even though consumer is also learning and firms also learning, but you only need to track 2 lambdas. If you introduce more asymmetry, you're going to have 4 lambdas, et cetera. That's going to blow things up. So in the equilibrium, we're going to do the following. So we're going to go from backward. We're going to first say, once the firm set up the recommendation algorithms, and assume consumer can observe what they are. First, we're going to solve consumer's dynamic choice rule. So over time, when does consumer go to firm 1, firm 2, in response to the quality of whether he likes the recommendations or not. And then we're going to take the user's behavior as a given. We're going to solve the time 0 game where firms simultaneously choose the algorithm. So equilibrium in this case is generally not unique. So we're going to narrow down to equilibrium that satisfy 2 properties. The first property is we're going to make it stationary. So a firm, essentially, firm's recommendation is just dependent on the lambda, right? So my belief about your type. So it's just a function of that, which the lambda is going to update over time. So my recommendation is going to be different, but the mapping is a stationary Markov, right, function, which means that there's no attempt to infer users lambda on the other platform, right? Which technically I have some information. I know that consumer spent some time there, so I have some truncated distribution, right, about what the consumer is over there. But there's very little information. I think in practice, there's I don't know of at least algorithms that are trying to explicitly kind of somehow infer that what the user's experience on the other platform is. So that's the first feature. The second feature is, well, right, so we have some priors, lambda 0 at firm 1 and firm 2. Those are going to affect what can be equilibrium or not. But so we want equilibrium that can be invariant to initial position. So any kind of initial position, you get the same the same pair of strategies can be equilibrium, right? So that's actually I think something desirable, because essentially if you think there's a distribution of consumer, right, that arrive with different prior, right, the different demographics, for example, to begin with, we're not, in practice, we're not choosing a different algorithm for each consumer from each demographic. It's the same mapping that's being used, right? Same algorithm that's being used for all demographics.
Sorry
So
for
saying
the
equilibrium would be, yeah.
Dr. Nang. So you have 5 minutes left till the end of the discussion.
Oh, okay. All right. Speed things up a little bit. All right. So that's the equilibrium we need, and so equilibrium that satisfy these two properties does actually exist and is unique. Let me skip that a little bit. So what does it look like? So it looked like the following. So remember, before we have these two thresholds, where one threshold marks monopolies for looking algorithm. One is the myopic threshold. Myopic threshold is the same whether you're a monopoly or not. What happened is the duopoly's optimal threshold is actually somewhere in between. And it's moderated by the user's discount rate. So as user's discount rate converges to the firm's discount rate, the duopoly's threshold becomes the same, the algorithm becomes the same as monopoly's algorithm. If users are more the user goes to be myopic, essentially the duopoly optimal algorithm becomes the myopic algorithm. So a couple interpretations. One, competitive pressure pushes firm towards exploitation, right? So duopoly in general is higher than monopoly's forward-looking threshold. So this is less exploration, more exploitation, more mass content. Two, this is what I said, competition leads to offer more mass market content in general and slower speed of learning. Three, the effect, this jump is stronger when users are less patient. And by extension of that, and also look, the duopoly's forward-looking threshold is a function of users' discount rate. So that captures the user's time preferences, whereas the monopoly threshold is captures the firm's time preferences. And so what that also means is that as our user discount rate increases, the optimal forward-looking algorithm is going to approach the myopic algorithm, and by extension, the industry return from having this forward-looking versus myopic is going to converge to zero, all the way converge to zero as user become less and less patient. And so we said that before. Let me skip that. I want to talk about something. Oh, and so the equilibrium is essentially so we considered different technology levels. So what I'm about to say in the next 2 minutes are actually new. They're not. They're just added in. They're not in the version of the draft that was submitted to the conference. So you can consider a different level of technologies for looking versus one firm have forward looking, one firm have myopic, and etc. You can consider a firm have different speed of learning. But what we want to do next is actually think about a more explicit investment game up front. So consider now that a firm first choose simultaneously whether to invest into this upgrade from myopic to forward looking, given some cost K. And then they choose the algorithm, and then they compete and get a result. But the difficulty here is with this type of multi-arm bandit problem, there's no explicit solution for the return. So even though I know what the equilibrium look like, I don't know the expected utility of each firm. So we're going to do that using we do that using simulations with the step size of 0.05 and the total length of 2000, do over 1,000, average over 1,000 runs. So we get utilities under different discount, the user's discount rate under different, so both firm are forward-looking, one firm forward-looking, one firm myopic, and both firm myopic get the utility. So take that simulation result as a given. You can look at an investment game. So just one word before we finish. So here is 2 words, I guess. So this is the higher, this is when both firm industry return when both firm have forward looking. The lower is when the industry return with both myopic as a function of investment cost. So when cost is high, nobody invests, right? So both myopic. When firm is low, both firm invest. But because this is return net of the investment cost, because there's an externality you're exerting on the opponent, it turned out there is a prisoner's dilemma, where when both firms invest in this range, that everybody's actually worse off than when nobody invests. And so when discount return goes higher, the return from that forward-looking algorithm industry is lower, but it also squeezes the range to which firm invest. So you have a smaller range in which prisoner's dilemma happen and a smaller size of that. So in this case, it can actually be a good thing if a more impatient user push you out of the prisoner's dilemma. So it can actually be good for the user. So for the consumer. So my time is up. I'm just gonna stay with this slide, which is a couple takeaway from the investment game. So you can have asymmetric where one firm invests, one firm doesn't. You can have symmetric, and there's prisoner dilemma, etc. So I think I'm right on time. I'm gonna stop, and I'm gonna give it to Mohammed. Thank you. Let me stop my screen there. All right. Was there a problem
Right,
with
sorry, I'm trying to, just 1 second.
because we could see it.
Yeah, one more time. All right. Can you see the slides?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Eddie. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Mohammed Zia. I'm an assistant professor of marketing at the Chapman University, located in Orange, California. I would like to thank the conference committee for assigning me this interesting paper to discuss. This is a paper by Kao, Manning, and San about exploration versus exploitation strategies when firms design their recommendation systems. All right, what to recommend? So many platforms are looking for the best answer for this like billion-dollar question, right? So the difficulty comes from the fact that firms are not fully aware about the customer's preferences and interests. A firm has two general strategies. First, to show the user the mass market content, a content that would be appealing for most customers with a high probability. For example, today's news websites, probably an article about Russia's invasion of Ukraine or Biden's State of the Union address would be a good example of mass market content. Or the platform can recommend a niche market content, something that is very, very interesting and attractive for some of the users, but not very interesting for the rest of them. So the importance and value of this niche content comes from the fact that if the platform can show them to the right audience, they can generate a lot of engagements and revenue for the firm. So if the firm knew exactly the interests and preferences of every single user in the market, it could simply target them with their preferred niche content. But the problem is the firm does not know, right, the user's interests. And even repeated interactions with the same user again and again, do not fully reveal the preferences of that user. And that's where the idea of exploration versus exploitation comes in. Of course, firm can always exploit by showing user the mass market content and earn an average decent engagement level. Or firm can explore by recommending a niche market content to a user in order to basically understand and learn about her preferences, which in the future can help to serve her better with a better niche content. All right. So this exploration exploitation approach is basically the basis of this forward-looking adaptive recommendation algorithm, which is the central focus of this paper. But an alternative approach would be a myopic approach. A myopic recommendation algorithm recommends a user the content that has basically the highest chance of instantaneous, immediate engagement. Well, although the myopic algorithm still uses the prior data on that specific user, but it does not consider the long-term benefits of exploring and learning her preferences. So an important contribution basically of this paper is to understand under what condition a forward-looking approach to recommendation outperforms and is better than a myopic approach. Another important contribution of the paper is to understand the role of competition on the value of these forward-looking algorithms. For example, consider Instagram and TikTok, both competing for user attention. Now, when I'm watching Instagram Reels, if Instagram fails to keep me watching, for example, by showing some niche video that I hate, I might immediately close my Instagram and open TikTok, right? So intuitively, competition might increase the cost of exploring customer preferences and shift firms' strategies more towards exploitation and sticking to what they believe users would most probably like, okay, which is basically the mass market content. So to solve this for optimal forward-looking recommendation algorithm, authors formulate the problem as a stochastic continuous time optimal control problem. The game is between, in the monopoly case, the game is between one single user and one firm. And the firm objective is to maximize its long-term profit, that is summation of the expected profits, this Y, across repeated interaction with the same user during time. So at each moment, this expected profit, which is basically the probability that the user likes and engages with the content, is a function of the firm recommendation action S, and also the firm's belief about the user type, whether the user is type 1 or type 2. And this belief, lambda, about the user type evolves during time according to this stochastic differential equation, which includes this Wiener process. So authors nicely solve this stochastic optimal control problem, find the value function and the threshold for the firm's belief about the user type, this lambda hat. So the optimal forward-looking recommendation algorithm is very nice and intuitive. So firms should recommend niche content 1 if the firm sufficiently believes that this user is type 1. Firm should recommend niche content type 2 if it sufficiently believes that the user is of type 2. And finally, the firm should recommend mass market content if the firm believes about the user type is basically in the intermediate range. So comparing this solution with the solution for a myopic recommendation algorithm, they find that a forward-looking adaptive algorithm increases the firm's long-term profits, even though in the short term, the firm has to sacrifice some of the immediate profits in order to explore and learn about the user's interests. And of course, they also extend the model to capture the interaction in a duopoly model. So compared to a monopolist, duopoly firms put more emphasis on exploitation and recommend more of this mass market content. Consequently, they find that incentives to invest in forward-looking technologies might be lower in competitive markets compared to a monopoly market. They also look at the user welfare implication. It turns out that in monopoly case, forward-looking algorithms may actually hurt the user surplus, but under competition, it always boosts the welfare for the user. Now, just some, I just want to share some few thoughts and comments about the paper and its assumption. So the first comment is about the definition and identification of mass market versus niche market content. It was not very clear to me how these two types of contents are distinguished and defined. For example, should a firm use some aggregate popularity measures, such as number of likes, shares, views, to define the mass versus niche? Are they defined like at the content topic, for example, COVID-19, midterm election, things like that, or categories like sports news, politics news, or music news, things like that? So some examples and mapping to the real world example can help a lot. Also, somewhat related to this first comment, it is assumed that the preferences for the two types of niche contents are negatively and perfectly correlated. So if the probability that someone likes niche content 1 is alpha, the probability that she likes niche content 2 is 1 minus alpha. So given that there are probably many different niche content out there, so this assumption seems a bit unrealistic. I think it would be better to assume that, for example, the two probabilities are independent, alpha 1 and alpha 2, and the rest would be the outside option. And also it seems that in this paper, there is no distinction between user liking the content, engaging with the content, or consuming the content. So all these concepts are used interchangeably in the paper. However, I think in real world, there is a clear distinction between these concepts. And I think this distinction has a very important implication for the results of the paper. For example, consider Instagram Reels or stories. When Instagram recommends me a video, I can immediately swipe up and pass that, right? Or I can watch like the first 5 seconds of it and then swipe up. Or I can watch the entire video. Or even one step further, I can actually hit the like or dislike button after watching it. So these different customer behavior can have completely different implication for how firm learn customer interests and update its belief about the customer type. So my next comment is about the customer types, which was discussed a little bit also in the presentation, and the fact that they are aware about their own types. I thought this is the assumption, at least in the monopoly case. So model assumes that customers exactly know what type of niche content he or she is interested in, right? This may not be fully realistic assumption. In practice, a lot of time we actually start engaging with the content for the mere purpose to understand whether we actually like it or not, okay? So if that's the case, then just the engagement with the content might send the wrong signal for the firm, and the firm infers that this partial engagement might mean that the customer actually likes the content. However, the customer is just trying to understand his own type, okay? Another question would be, if customers are fully aware about their own type, and if I know exactly what type of niche content I like, why not just go simply and search for it? So almost all platforms these days allow users to search and find their preferred content. I understand this might be a little bit outside of the scope of the paper, but allowing for the possibility that a user searches for their niche content in the platform can actually lower the platform's incentives for exploration and shift the strategy more toward exploitation. So that also might worth thinking about. Finally,
sorry for the interruption, Doctor.
Time is
You
up.
have 1 minute left.
Yeah, this is my final point. I think models should also assume that the platform can also learn something from the interaction of user with mass market type of content. So in the current model, it is assumed that the firm learns nothing from this interaction. In other words, if the firm shows mass market content, it cannot learn anything about the customer. However, I think in practice, firms can learn something from this interaction, because if the user does not like or engage with the mass market content, it would imply that they are probably more interested in the niche market content and less interested in the mass market content. And that can impact firms' incentives for exploration versus exploitation. But very nice paper, very interesting result, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Mohammed. I actually don't know if I should respond a sentence or actually probably there's time to move on. But yeah, thank you so much for the discussion. I might steal some of the example you gave earlier. I think those are
Thank you.
pretty nice, nicer than the one I have. All right, thank you. I'm gonna shut up.
All right, I guess maybe I can get started if everyone can hear me. So thanks so much for having me. And it's a great pleasure to be able to present in this SPAS conference. I really appreciate it, the opportunity. This is thanks also thanks to the organizing committee for selecting the paper, and thanks everyone for tuning in. This paper is joint work with, I'm Louis Yan. I'm an assistant professor of operations and information technology management at Berkeley Haas. And the paper is joint work with my two colleagues at National University of Singapore. So the title of this talk suggests, the paper is all about the right to repair. So what is the right to repair? Now, what the right to repair movement asserts is that consumers ought to have the right to repair their own product, whether it be cell phones, cars, tractors, or household appliances. If they can't really repair it, they don't truly own it. And more specifically, the right to repair movement calls for government legislation that requires manufacturers to share repair information, provide diagnostic tools, and supply service parts to facilitate independent repair, which can be conducted either by consumers themselves or by third-party repair shops. In recent years, the Right to Repair initiative has gained considerable traction all around the world. Now, for example, in Europe, the European Commission now legally requires manufacturers to supply spare parts. In Australia, the Productivity Commission is considering revising the copyright law to enable third-party repair. And here in the United States, the Motor Vehicle Owners' Right to Repair Act was first passed in Massachusetts in 2012, and that later morphed into a nationwide MOU in 2014. And more recently, in 2020, an amendment to the original Massachusetts law was passed to cover telematic systems and support an open data access platform. In addition to cars, the right to repair has also been advocated for farm equipment, namely tractors. Multiple prominent 2020 presidential candidates have come out in support of a nationwide right to repair law for farm equipment, although neither candidate made it to the White House, obviously. The one who did also deeply cares about the right to repair. And in fact, the Biden administration signed an executive order back in July 2021, directing the Federal Trade Commission to draft new regulations that would give consumers more rights to repair products independently. In addition to the federal level initiative, there is also a lot of efforts at the state level. As of now, 27 states have considered digital right to repair bills, but none of these bills have actually been passed. Well, part of the reason why these legislative attempts fell through is that many big tech companies are in fact spending big dollars lobbying against these bills, often on privacy, copyright, and safety grounds. As we can see, the issue of the right to repair is very much ongoing and ever evolving. Yet, despite all the ramifications, the key arguments that repair advocates use remain unchanged. And here is what repair advocates say. The right to repair should benefit consumers because it breaks manufacturers' monopoly on the repair market and expands consumer choice by allowing them to turn to independent repair. Further, these repair advocates would argue that the right to repair should also benefit the environment because it allows products to last longer, and as a consequence, consumers do not buy as many new products or scrap as many old ones, which translates into less production and less e-waste. And last but not least, repair advocates would also say, or rather point out, that the real reason why manufacturers fiercely lobby against right to repair is not really because they care so much about consumers' privacy or safety, but rather they worry that the right to repair bill would really hurt the own interest, the manufacturer's own interest, by diminishing repair profit and cannibalizing new product sales. Now, all of this makes intuitive sense, but what repair advocates often don't really talk about is what manufacturers will do if profit loss is a sure outcome of the right to repair legislation. In other words, in a last-ditch effort to mitigate the inevitable profit loss, how will the manufacturer adjust the new product price, and what are the welfare and environmental implications? And this much overlooked pricing angle is really the focus of our paper. And I believe this pricing angle should also be of interest to the marketing community. Now, more specifically, we will ask the following research questions. How does the right to repair affect the manufacturer's pricing decisions? So does it truly benefit consumers, as repair advocates argue? And does the right to repair truly benefit the environment? And we're going to scrutinize these three questions using an analytical model. Before I jump into the model, I would like to pause here just in case there are any questions from the audience at this point about the general context of the right to repair. Any questions or comments from the audience at this point before we move on? Great, thanks for the silence. We're now going to jump right into our model. So we're going to consider a discrete time infinite horizon model of a manufacturer who sells a finally durable product to a continuum of consumers. Okay. The product is finally durable. It can last at most 2 periods. In the first period of the product, we call it a new product. And in the second period, we call it a used product or an old product. The manufacturer is a monopolist in the new product market. This approximates a setting where the manufacturer has sufficient market power, which can be the case in a variety of durable goods contexts, such as John Deere in the tractor space or Apple in the iPhone space. Now, consumers are forward-looking. They're expecting utility maximizers, and they're interested in using one product in each period. Now, let's take a look at what happens over the life cycle of a product. Of course, we're going to start with a new product. Consumers' valuation is theta. Consumer valuation theta of the new product is uniformly distributed between 0 and 1. The unit production cost of a new product is C, and the new product price is PN, which is set by the manufacturer. After one period of use, a product fails with probability F and still works with probability 1 minus F. Now, if it is still functional, then consumer valuation of this functional use product will be delta times theta, where delta is something that's between 0 and 1, which really captures the physical decay or deterioration of a product after one period of use. So the idea here is that using an old product for one period is not as desirable as using a new product for a single period, all else equal. Functional use products can also be traded on the secondary market at price PU, which is determined endogenously. Now moving to the lower branch, if a product fails, then it will be of no value to consumers. However, it can be repaired and restored. And that's the key idea of this paper. So the repair choice is really in the hands of consumers. They can choose whether to repair, and if so, where to repair. If they turn to the manufacturer for repair, they pay the manufacturer repair price PER, and the manufacturer incurs a cost CM for the repair. Alternatively, if consumers seek independent repair, they incur cost CI, which is the independent repair cost. Now, essentially what the right to repair legislation does, at least within the scope of our model, is making independent repair easier so that CI essentially goes down. So that's really the focus of our analysis. So it's all about how an exogenous reduction of CI due to legislative forces impacts endogenous outcomes. All right, so going back to the model, a functional use product can be used for one more period, after which it reaches end of life and will be disposed of. So here in our model, 3 segments of consumers emerge. Essentially, low type consumers will be inactive. They're not really going to participate. Consumers of an intermediate type buy a used product every single period from the secondary market. And those consumers of a high type, high valuation, buy a new product every single period. And after one period of use, they're going to sell it if it does not fail. So again, one thing I would like to highlight here is that this is an infinite horizon model. We're essentially looking at the steady state, even though every single product will only last for 2 periods. So if the product, for example, reaches end of life, then the consumer is going to decide whether to purchase a new product or whether to stay inactive or whether to purchase a used product from the secondary market. So consumers are long-lived, but each product only lasts 2 periods. So here, of course, we have 2 thresholds in terms of consumer type, theta 1, theta 2. They can really be determined by these indifference conditions. And also, we have the used product price PU. Okay, so that's really determined by the market clearing condition, which is essentially says that the demand on the secondary market, which is the size of this segment, should be exactly equal to the supply of the secondary market. All right, so the market clears, and that gives us the endogenous secondary market price, used product price PU. So once we have that, we can really formulate the manufacturer's pricing problem. So the manufacturer determines the new product price PN and the manufacturer repair price PR to maximize its profit per period. And its profit term is really composed of 2 parts. The first one is the profit from selling new products, and the second one is the profit from providing repair services. All right, so here, before we talk about the equilibrium of this model, let me first highlight the key trade-off the manufacturer faces. Now, in general, providing repair service is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it generates additional profit for the manufacturer, and more importantly, it strengthens consumers' valuation of the product over its entire life cycle, which enables the manufacturer to price the new product higher. And this is what we refer to as the value enhancement effect. On the other hand, providing repair also encourages consumers to substitute toward used products, which cannibalize new product sales. And this is what we refer to as the demand cannibalization effect. So the manufacturer really tries to balance these 2 effects. And in light of this trade-off, how much repair the manufacturer would like to offer depends on how costly it is to make new products. Now, if a new product is very cheap to produce, then the manufacturer will like to produce a lot of new products. And as a consequence, it wants consumers to buy new. So the focus here is to really avoid demand cannibalization and eliminate repair. On the other hand, if a new product is very costly to produce, then the manufacturer wants the product to actually last long. So the focus now becomes how to best tap into the value enhancement effect and facilitate the repair. Okay. So again, if the production cost is low on a per unit basis, then the manufacturer actually wants to eliminate repair to avoid demand cannibalization. If the production cost is high on a per unit basis, then the manufacturer actually wants to facilitate repair to tap into value enhancement effect. Okay. Now, once we understand this trade-off, our equilibrium, this is exactly what the equilibrium essentially looks like. Okay. Especially when the independent repair cost CI is high, so that the manufacturer doesn't really need to worry about the threat of independent repair. So if the production cost is low, okay, then the manufacturer essentially does not offer repair at all, and we will have a no repair equilibrium in which no consumers seek repair upon product failure. And one implementation of this strategy is to charge an exorbitantly high repair price to deter repair altogether, which, as you could imagine, is actually very common in practice. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if the repair price is actually set very high, so if the repair price is set very high, then consumers simply won't really bother to repair, and as a consequence, they will simply buy a new product if the old product fails. Now, at the other end of the extreme, if the production cost is very high, then the manufacturer offers repair for free so that everyone seeks repair upon failure. And this is what we call a full free repair equilibrium. So one implementation of this strategy is essentially to offer lifetime warranty that ensures consumers against the risk of potential product failure. Now, if we're talking about an intermediate production cost, then of course what the manufacturer does will also fall in the range of fall in the intermediate range. And over there, the manufacturer takes a balanced approach and charges an intermediate repair price that induces a partial repair equilibrium, in which some consumers seek repair and some don't. So this is what happens when the independent repair cost is so high that it's not going to really be a threat to the manufacturer. When the independent repair cost is lower, then of course it will matter, but the high level structure is preserved. Essentially, what we see here is still, if the production cost is low, we're going to have a no repair equilibrium. If the production cost is intermediate, we're going to have a partial repair equilibrium. And if the production cost is high, we're going to have a full repair equilibrium. So what is worth noting here is that as CI decreases from the right to the left, the full repair equilibrium region expands, whereas the no repair region shrinks, which makes intuitive sense because now repair becomes less costly for those seeking independent repair. And as a consequence, consumers are more prone to seek repair under a wider range of conditions. All right, so now that we understand what the equilibrium looks like, we can really take this approach of essentially comparative statics by looking into the impact of the right to repair, looking into the impact of the right to repair legislation by really examining the comparative statics with respect to CI, okay, the independent repair cost. So specifically, we're going to examine these four metrics: the new product price that the manufacturer charges, consumer surplus, social welfare, and the environmental impact.
Louis, can I ask you a quick question before going to the next
Yes, please
section?
go ahead.
So what is the impact of that failure probability on the monopoly's decision to offer repair? Yeah,
So failure.
Yeah, if the failure probability.
I think we did do that in the paper. So here, we've actually fixed the failure probability. But the thing is that if for example, if the failure probability is really low, right, then essentially repair doesn't really matter that much if you think about it, right? Because it's not going to be relevant in the second period for most of the consumers. So that's why in this case, actually I choose the failure probability of my model to be relatively high, so their repair will actually be somewhat more consequential. Yeah, so I think that's a very good point. Yeah, but in terms of, for example, how these regions change as F changes, we actually did that, but I didn't recall off the top of my head. But that's a very, very good question.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, Ren, please go ahead.
So F, the failure rate is exogenous, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the model.
Yes, in this main model, but we did consider an extension that actually
Right, but one would anticipate, at least over some long run, that's going to change.
Mm-hmm.
How will that change?
Yeah, so what we consider is that basically by endogenous F, the failure probability, essentially what happens is that, so this is what we call essentially the durability strategy, right? Which will basically complement the pricing strategy. So what we show here, what we show in that extension is that the manufacturer's price response is actually in lockstep with the manufacturer's durability response, which means if the manufacturer decides to, for example, reduce the product price in response to the right to repair legislation, then the manufacturer will also actually reduce its durability, which means increasing the failure rate if the manufacturer can actually change the failure rate. And likewise, in some cases, the manufacturer will actually increase the product price, new product price. And in such a case, the manufacturer will also actually increase the product durability by decreasing F if the manufacturer can actually change that parameter.
Okay, so they go together. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, they complement each other side by side.
Thank you.
Is essentially what we find from our analysis. Yeah, but that's a very good point. Thank you. Any other questions, comments before we move on? All right, so now let's first take a look at the new product price that the manufacturer charges in response to the right to repair legislation, which is really, really important. So that's why I really want to emphasize, here, because it drives essentially the rest of the results. So here's essentially what the new product price looks like. Now, our results can be really summarized by this figure, which illustrates how the new product price the manufacturer charges changes with the independent repair cost, CI. So the way to read this figure is to really go from the right to the left, because here the horizontal axis is the independent repair cost. And as the right to repair legislation becomes stronger and stronger, we would expect the independent repair cost to really go down, to decline. Okay. And here the vertical axis, of course, is the new product price that the manufacturer charges in equilibrium. So we plot three representative curves corresponding to three different levels of production cost. High production cost in black, low production cost in red, and intermediate production cost in blue. Now, if the production cost is really high, then the right to repair legislation will not actually make a difference, as illustrated by the black line, since the manufacturer already gives away repair for free. Okay, so this is kind of the not so interesting case. What is more interesting is what happens when the production cost is low. As explained earlier, in this case, the manufacturer's focus is really on avoiding demand cannibalization because new products can be so cheaply produced. And as a consequence, the manufacturer really wants to guard against repair. Okay. So if that's the case, then as CI decreases, due to the right to repair legislation, the threat of independent repair becomes stronger. So in order to still maintain the original no repair equilibrium, the manufacturer has to lower the new product price and adopt a volume strategy. Doing so will encourage consumers to simply buy a new product as a replacement rather than repair a failed used product. Okay. So in this case, the right to repair triggers a price decrease. But of course, it's not always the case. As we can see here, when the production cost is intermediate, then the manufacturer will initially still follow a volume strategy to limit repair, right? As we can see here. But then as CI keeps decreasing and falls below a certain threshold, the manufacturer actually switches to a margin strategy. It raises the new product price and accompany it with free repair. Okay, so this is really a regime shift that we're talking about here. Now, in this case, essentially what happens is that because the production cost is not so low, there's only so much that the manufacturer can do by lowering the price to limit repair. At a certain point, the price will simply become so low that the profit margin gets too thin for the volume strategy to still work. So the manufacturer might as well tap into the value enhancement effect that we talked about of repair by actually raising the new product price, facilitating repair, and prolonging product lifespan. So the key takeaway here is that the price response is not always monotonic. Right? If the production cost is low, then the manufacturer will, ambiguously lower the new product price. However, if the production cost is intermediate, then the manufacturer will initially follow a volume strategy by lowering the price, but beyond a certain point, the manufacturer will actually raise the price and switch to a margin strategy. Right? And this non-monotonic price response is a key driver, again, as I said earlier, for the rest of the results. For example, when it comes to consumer surplus, what we see here is that it basically follows exactly the opposite trend of the new product price response. Okay, so for example, when the production cost is low, the new product price will be decreased as the right to repair legislation gets stronger, and as a consequence, consumers are better off. Okay, so this is kind of what essentially this aligns with what repair advocates claim. The right to repair legislation should benefit consumers, and in this case, it does. And the side benefit is that now the price, the products become cheaper. However, that's not always true, right? As we can see here, if the production cost is intermediate, then there's this non-monotonic response, right? If the right to repair legislation becomes really strong, then the new product price is increased. The manufacturer jacks up the price, and as a consequence, consumers are actually worse off. Right? So in this case, if you think about it, there's already a profit loss on the part of the manufacturer, and on top of that, consumers are also worse off. So in this case, the right to repair legislation can actually lead to a lose-lose situation for both the manufacturer and consumers. And if we were to think about social welfare, that is the sum of the manufacturer's profit and consumer surplus. Essentially, the curves look very similar to those for the consumer surplus. And the key takeaway here is, again, there sometimes will be a non-monotonic welfare response as a result of the right to repair legislation. Consumers are not always better off, and social welfare is not always improved. All right, now let's talk about what happens to the environment. What is the environmental impact? In order for us to do that, we will first need to define the environmental impact. And for that, we're going to take a product lifecycle approach to really account for different phases of the environmental impact. So specifically, we're going to consider 3 lifecycle phases: production, use, and disposal. So this lifecycle approach is actually very common in the environmental economics literature and as well as the industrial ecology literature. So here's the production impact that we're going to account for, and also this disposal impact, and then the use impact. And once we have these 3 impacts, now we're going to add them together, and that gives us the total environmental impact. Okay. So if you're perceptive enough, essentially what we're doing here is that we're essentially taking a weighted sum of 3 quantities. Okay, Q, UU, and R. So Q is the new production volume, okay, which is the size of this segment. UU is the volume of all products in use, which is essentially the size of this segment, and R is the repair volume. Okay, So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to track the change of these three equilibrium quantities, and once we piece them together, and that will give us the impact of the right to repair legislation on the total environmental impact. Okay, so this is what these three environmental metrics look like. Okay, so we're going to start with repair volume, which is pretty intuitive, right? So as the independent repair cost becomes lower, consumers seek more repair, and as a consequence, the repair volume goes up. Okay. Of course, what's more interesting is really what happens to the new production volume as well as the volume of oil products in use. Again, the key driver here is the new product price, right? If you look at the new production volume, essentially its trend is exactly the opposite of the new product price. If the new product price decreases when the production cost is low, then the new production volume increases, right? Which essentially contradicts what repair advocates claim. Now there's going to be actually more products produced and also more e-waste. And it's a consequence of the right to repair legislation. Once again, because of a lower new product price, consumers simply are going to buy more. Okay. And more interestingly, when the production cost is intermediate, we're going to see a non-monotonic response, right? As the new product price decreases, originally, when the manufacturer follows a volume strategy, the new production volume goes up. And then when the manufacturer switches to a margin strategy by raising the new product price, we're actually going to see lower new production volume. Okay. So when it comes to the volume of old products in use, sometimes depending on the parameters, it's going to look very similar to what happens to the production volume, but not always, right? In this case, so what is different here is what happens when the production cost is intermediate. As you can see here, as the independent repair cost decreases as a result of the right to repair legislation, the volume of old products in use actually monotonically increases. Okay, this doesn't quite really follow the price response over here, but essentially what happens here is because now repair actually compels consumers to substitute toward old products, and as a consequence, the volume of old products in use will also increase. Okay, so in this case, that becomes the dominant force, and as a consequence, we're going to see a monotonic increase throughout, across the board. Okay, so we're going to really, put everything together and look at the joint effects of the right to repair legislation on both consumers and the environment. Okay, so here's kind of the summary of our results by piecing everything together. When the production cost is low, the implication is relatively straightforward, at least clear. The right to repair legislation is going to be a win-lose proposition. It's going to benefit consumers, but it's going to increase the environmental impact and thereby harms the environment. So here are some examples of relatively low cost products. Cell phones, microwaves will fit the bill. However, when the production cost is intermediate, because we have this non-monotonic price response, of course, everything becomes a bit more complicated. Specifically, the right to repair legislation can be a win-lose, lose-win, or a lose-lose situation, depending on the strength of the legislation, and also depending on which phase is the dominant phase in terms of the environmental impact. So here's what it looks like. So the way to read this figure is that the horizontal axis is the CI, independent repair cost, before the right to repair legislation, and the vertical axis is CI after the right to repair legislation. As a consequence, so we should only focus on the lower triangle because CI after should be below CI before. Okay, so in this case, the production cost is intermediate, and the production and disposal phases are the dominant phase are of environmental impact. These are the phases where the majority of environmental impacts come from. So one case in point will be high performance, high end computers that may fit the bill. We're going to see essentially either a win-lose situation or lose-win situation. Okay, depending on kind of the strength of the right to repair legislation. Okay, if after the right to repair legislation, CI, the independent repair cost, is really low, we're going to have a lose-win situation, meaning that consumers are going to be worse off, okay, but the environment is going to be better off. The environmental impact is going to be reduced. Okay.
Louis,
Yes.
so these gamma parameters, the weight on the impact of different stages. So these are exogenous parameters?
Right, yes. This is kind of the per unit impact, for example, during production, the per unit impact is during disposal, so on and so forth. Yes, so
and then
these are given parameters.
How sensitive is these win-lose results to the choice selection of these exogenous parameters?
Oh, so that's the whole point over here, right? So here, this is essentially saying the production and disposal impacts are the dominant impacts, right? So these are, so as a consequence, their corresponding parameters are bigger, right? So that's essentially the idea. So what this is essentially saying is that a new production volume is kind of the biggest contributor to the environmental impact. So the overall trend of the environment, the total environmental impact, will be similar to the trend of the new production volume. So this is what it is essentially saying, okay, if that makes sense. Yeah. If you look at, for example, the industrial ecology literature, they basically will provide very detailed calibration of all these parameters, right? So, for example, they will say, for high-end, I could have the easy examples, right? For cars and tractors, the use phase will be the dominant phase, whereas, for example, for cell phones, actually the production disposal phases will be the dominant phases. Okay, so it varies across product categories. Okay, and this actually leads us to kind of the other scenario. What happens if the use phase is the dominant phase, right? For example, tractors, cars, refrigerators, they all fall into this category. They all fall into this camp. So essentially, what really I want to highlight here is this region right here. We're going to actually have a lose, triple lose situation. Okay, so in this case, what this means is that the right to repair legislation, by the virtue of a decrease in the independent repair cost, will lower the manufacturer profit, reduce consumer surplus, and increase the environmental impact. Okay. And to put this result into context, we can think about what happens in Massachusetts, right? As I said, at the beginning of the talk, the Motor Vehicle Owners' Right to Repair Act was first passed in 2012, and it was later amended in 2020 to allow for to also accommodate open access data platforms. So essentially, what this is saying in the context of our model is that originally the strength of the right to repair legislation is relatively weak. So even after RTR, the independent repair costs may still be relatively high. However, once you have the second shot, second strike, so to speak, then the independent repair costs will become even lower, right? Because the strength of the legislation becomes stronger. So what may happen, right, according to our analysis, is that in 2012, this new piece of legislation may trigger a win-lose situation, which means it's going to hurt the consumer's interest, but at least it's going to benefit consumers at the expense of the environment, to the detriment of the environment. However, once this legislation becomes even stronger, by further pushing down the independent repair cost, we're actually going to see a triple lose situation, which is really something that's very alarming, something that we have to keep close eyes on. All right, so we do consider several extensions in this paper. I guess probably the most relevant extension, according to our earlier discussion, is this one endogenizing durability. Okay, so I guess I can quickly show that, given that we still have a few minutes left. So just very quickly, essentially, the durability strategy complements the pricing strategy. As we can see over here, if the price goes down, then the manufacturer's durability choice will also go down. As a result, if the price goes up, then the manufacturer's durability choice will also go up. Okay, so they really complement each other. Is essentially the finding of this extension. Okay, so with that, I would like to really conclude my presentation by really wrapping everything up. So what we consider here in this paper is really this emergent right to repair legislation that's kind of gaining ground all over the globe. It is really meant to facilitate independent repair by providing more repair information, supply service parts, or providing diagnostic tools. However, it may really trigger a non-monotonic price response from the manufacturer in the product market. And as a consequence, the right to repair can harm both consumers and the environment, right? Contrary to the common belief, contrary to the key arguments of repair advocates. And specifically, the right to repair legislation can create a lose-lose-lose outcome when the production cost is intermediate, when the environmental impact is dominated by the use phase, and when the right to repair legislation results in a very sharp reduction in the independent repair cost. So our paper actually tells a cautionary tale about the right to repair. It highlights the inextricable link between the repair market and the product market, which is something that's actually not often talked about in the public debate of the right to repair legislation. So with that, I'm going to conclude my talk. Thank you so much for your greatest attention. I appreciate all the questions and discussion. And we'll be happy to take any questions before we hand it over to our discussant, if time permits. Any questions, comments? All right, I guess then I can probably hand it over to Baojun, my discussant, which I'm really thankful for in advance.
Sorry, I'm trying to get my thing ready here. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, wait, let me put a. Okay, there we go. Okay, thank you for the organizers for the invitation for me to discuss this paper, and it's a very interesting paper. I enjoyed reading it very much. I printed it out and thoroughly read it. It's a very nice paper with a very current topic, right? And so wait, let me here. Okay. Okay, no, okay, it's working. All right, and okay, so first, overall comments. The paper is very well motivated. It has a very relevant, managerially important context, the right to repair legislation and movement. And the paper is very well written, very clearly written. The models and analysis are very transparent. They explain things very well, and the logic is very clear. And the insights are very relevant to this type of market. Okay. And so my comments are going to be like zooming out, right, to look at a bigger picture of this type of models. Okay, so I put, maybe perhaps there's a class of models. So in this class of models, we would have two markets that are related. There's a primary market where we may sell, a main product, okay, and there's a related market. The related market can be, many different things. It could be a resale market where, the primary products are used and then sold, okay, or resold. Perhaps they are purchased and resold through intermediary. It could be a P2P sharing market or P2P kind of other type of markets, okay, where a customer may have purchased in the primary market and then they share it when they don't use it, or they sell it when they don't use it in the related secondary markets. And it could be a post-sale service market, like the current paper. Basically, after you purchase the product, you may need post-sale services for repair and other things, right? It could also be the related market could be a add-on market, where you have the primary product, but you want to add something to it, or perhaps you want to upgrade, right? So these are all related. So note that for these related markets, they exist only because there is a primary market. If there's no primary product, then there's no used goods, no after sales service, or no other things, right? So these kind of models would have basically have two parts, okay? And products purchase, note that product purchase in the primary market can have values in the related markets. So if some customer purchasing the new products, okay, in the related market, so either concurrently or sometime later, that product may have value to the customer. Okay, so if you know the product is durable, so basically we are talking about durable goods almost by definition, right? They last for multiple for a longer period of time. Okay, so in the current paper, it's like 2 periods. Actually, 2 periods doesn't matter whether how many periods it is, some finite or infinite number of periods. Okay, and and so now what are the trade-offs between these type of markets? So, so to the firms in operating in 1 or 2 markets, and to the consumers, so we have value enhancement effect. So because the related market may enhance the value of owning the product, right? And so if you have a higher value in the related products, then, well, consumers are going to be more willing to pay higher price in the primary market for the goods. And also, well, implicitly then, well, demand increases in the primary market, right? And vice versa. So demand can increase, margin can increase. You could potentially charge higher prices in the primary market because, you know, the related market can enhance the value. Okay? And there's also an effect, competition or cannibalization effect between the markets. Okay, so the existence or basically more competition in the related market can give consumers more options. I say they can buy new or used, they can share, they can you know, do other things, right? So with multiple options, so basically these are the primary market and the secondary market may have these cannibalization effect. So some demand may be shifting from the primary market to secondary market, or these are related markets. Okay. And in the current paper, basically, now if you repair a product, well, you can sell it as a used good, or you can use it, right, rather than buying new. So that's a new option. That's the related markets. And so that potentially could reduce the primary demand for new goods. So there's the trade-off between these, okay? And that trade-off may depend on costs and other parameters. So that's the larger picture of these type of models with primary and related markets. So I'm just going to you know, give a couple of examples through my own research, and to basically see how it's related to this, right? So in the bigger picture, right? And so actually the first paper, well, actually all my papers, okay. There are some other papers as well that do this. The first paper actually I presented at UT Dallas, the BAS conference in 2014 or 2015. So I found that slides and I copied a few. And then the second one I also presented at, second one actually, it was rejected by the UTD Dallas conference. Okay. And the third one I presented at UTD a few years ago too. So thank you you know, for those presentations. I got a very good feedback. Okay. So now I copied the slides from the 2015 presentation for this sharing market. Okay, let's see how this relates. And so basically we have one manufacturer that produces a good, okay, of the manufacturer would set the price to sell the product at product P, price P, and the quality is Q. So P and Q are decisions. The firm would design the product quality, and so consumers can use the product in many different periods. So periods are represented by the T here, many different periods. In each period, the use value is a product quality times theta, where theta is uniformly distributed between 0 and 1. And so now if consumers can purchase the product, okay, based on their expected valuation, use and renting in the future. Okay, so they could buy the product, become product owners, or they don't buy, and similar to the current paper, well, they could, potentially use secondary market, right? Use the used goods or buy the used goods and so on. So there are potential renters, and renting operations would depreciate the owner's products. Okay, there's a depreciation. There's a sharing market where this is the secondary market, the related market. In the sharing market, consumers essentially, like those who didn't purchase the product before, they are potential renters. They would be able to actually rent, okay, from the from the sharing market instead of buying from the firm. Okay, so this is like, okay, so we have the primary market where there's a direct sales, and we have secondary related market in the market. And so when we indulge in these, so the basic finding, actually, I also had this example before, and I just copied from the slides here. Okay, so I'm not going to explain the slides. So basically, I describe this. There's the value enhancement effect, the market expansion, and the cannibalization effect. And the trade-off actually depends on the cost of production. So if the cost of production is very similar to the current paper, if in fact, actually we use examples like tractors, equipment, cars, rental, this sharing actually would be win-win-win for everybody. Whereas a sharing of like inexpensive items, like cheaper items, like say power drills, it would be lose-lose, for the outcome. And basically, there's a value enhancement trade-off and the trade-off between value enhancement and cannibalization. Okay, so these things. And so similar in other contexts, actually, Tianxin's paper from JMR is also this type of models. So there's a primary market. Okay? In the primary market, actually, there are more decisions modeled here. The primary market, there's a, say, Ticketmaster would be selling the new tickets, right? But sometimes consumers may not be able to go. They would sell it on a resale platform and sell in the resale market. And then basically that paper looks at the trade-off and the decisions between musicians, decisions of venue size and ticket prices and so on. And so basically there's a interaction between the two related markets. And so different type of structures that were modeled in that paper. There's an independent platform. I say these essentially it's like the service in the current context of the paper. Okay, so this paper actually that Louis just presented is a service like market, right, related market. Here there's a resale platform, and the resale platform would basically allow users to sell their tickets if they cannot go under some conditions, right? And then the paper look at the integration between the primary and the secondary market, and also what if there's an independent resale platform and so on. And other type of settings, I didn't have time to copy from the other papers. And so there's could be a manufacturer, okay, entering the sharing market. So the manufacturer could be also offering, in the current context, it would be the manufacturer offering repair service, right? So here, actually, this is not like repair. This is just manufacturing, putting some units of the product into the sharing market to compete. So there's that setting, and to compete with the consumers who bought the product when they don't need it, they share, right? So there's a sharing, there's a primary market and secondary market there as well. Okay, so again, like these classes of type of models, I think have some strategic like trade-offs that are common. Okay, so the current paper, I see a lot of value that it's a substantive area, right, in the different substantive area, and there's the duration consideration and also production, but the sustainability concern, right? So those things are prominently discussed, and these are substantively useful insight in the current context. And so my minor suggestion, I put a very minor, okay, I just searched the paper is already a minor at management science. So my suggestions are going to be very, very minor. Okay. And so relate, these different contexts to different contexts, right? So basically the similarity between those contexts and the current context, and emphasizing on how the current context actually differs. And I see actually there's a differences like in terms of the substantive area, right? But the trade-off, as you can see, even the terminology used are the same, right? Value enhancement effect, cannibalization effect, market expansion, margin improvement. Those are discussed in the earlier paper already. But the new side in this context has not been discussed. There's some interesting discussion like that you have about either making service free, and these things are very important, I think, for the managers, right? So I think emphasizing those more in the paper would be useful to a general reader. And in terms of modeling, there could be like additional details, but knowing these models, I know it's very hard to basically endogenize other things. Actually, our model, we were all endogenized, right? But it took us a long time, many years. Okay, so here in this context, I could potentially see that in the model extension, if you consider, for example, the repair market, right? Repair market, there's interaction between third-party or self-repair and the firm's repair. In that, there's a part exchange, right? So basically, the manufacturer in this case actually can generate revenue from others' repair too, right? So that interaction is not a model. Actually, there's you could have service like differentiation, but even if there's no service differentiation, you can generate profit from there, right? So then you can look at new questions like having more competition actually can benefit you. Like there's a direct benefit as well, which is not discussed in the paper. Direct benefit is when others enter the repair market, you actually sell more parts, right? So this market expand, they can increase the services market and to reduce the waste, right? And you benefit from selling more parts or giving more guidance, selling the rights to repair, right? Essentially, basically, there may be proprietary things that the firm has, okay, that need to be licensed to the other like self-repair or third-party repairs. So you can model these details and to increase the substantive insight and relevance to the current setting, right? In the current setting, like basically like the self-repair is like very hard to self-repair. Essentially, it's only labor cost essentially, right? There's no part exchange or licensing from the manufacturer about some technology, right? So that's the part. I think there could be a good paper, maybe a separate paper that you could examine. So similarly, in the new primary market, there could be more decisions modeled. And so in my other paper, I modeled like quality decision, pricing, entry decision in terms of quantity to enter, capacity constraint. These things are modeled. So there are other things that might be relevant in the current right to repair market. So I'm going to save a couple of minutes for my for the author to answer questions that others may have. Okay, Louis.
Yeah, thanks so much for the discussion. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, these are very nice suggestions. But I fully agree that kind of the technical difficulty involved, right? Once you kind of add all the bells and whistles, then the tractability can get in the way.
Right. Yeah,
I agree. These are important.
Like numerical, try to endogenize, but it's numerical example, like numerical calculations. Yeah, it's very hard to come by with a model that you can solve fully. Right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much. I guess we do have a couple minutes left in case there are any questions from the audience. I guess one thing I'd like to add is that all these 3 papers that you listed are actually very well known in the OM community. So it's like very well known, very well circulated. I've read all of them, and many of us do as well. In the community at large. So I really appreciate your contribution to the general field of business. These are fantastic works.
Thank you for the compliment, Louis. Yeah. So other questions? Pranav?
No, I was just saying we could not hear you.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah. Actually, I think there are many things that in this context that could be like modeled. Like sometimes like the related market may require like the coexistence of primary market. Other times it may be like there may be a time delay, and there could be actually there may be many related projects that could be done. But as Louis said, the models are very kind of complicated, right? You have essentially when you have decisions in both markets, it's very hard to model. So in his context, basically the main model basically uses the parameter, basically uses comparative statics, right? So you use a cost parameter to use comparative statics to model kind of like say, okay, here, what if this right to repair reduces this cost, right? What's the impact? But to explicitly model that market can be very difficult. So I think maybe those who are good at math can figure out some ways to simplify and model them, right? So I have many research questions that I don't have good models for, that I cannot solve, right? I mean, I can give you examples to show all the trade-offs, but then you cannot have a analytically closed form model framework, right? So that's the difficulty, as Louis pointed out. I think we are out of time. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much again. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So I think I'm up next. So I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see my slides? Yes?
Yes.
Great. So, well, thank you so much for joining this talk. I'm very excited to present this project that I've been working on with my co-author, Shreya Ambil, from the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in DC. And in this work, we are focusing on the value of professional ties in B2B markets. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to start by giving an introduction. I'm going to dive right into the research questions, and then talking a little bit about the importance, why we are interested in answering these questions, and then the empirical challenges we face. So I'm going to hold off on the institutional context. In this paper, we are looking in a very particular financial market. I'm going to hold off on the details for the first part to just make sure we are clear on what the research questions are. Then I'm going to talk about the institutional context, which is in the context of Repo Market. I'm going to explain the context of the market, why we chose that market. Then talk a little bit about the data, the analysis that we do, and the methods we use, potential mechanisms for the effect that we find. And then I'm going to conclude with some managerial implications of this work. So here's the research question. Imagine you are in a B2B setting, you have a selling organization, and you have a bunch of buying organizations. And then someone who is working for the buyer at some point moves and start working for the seller organization. Now, in between, she might, after leaving the buying organization, she might go and work for some other institutions. But at the end, she lands at the seller organization, and she moves up to be the decision maker in the relationship between the seller and the buyer. So the question that we ask is, in this situation, would she charge her ex-employer more or less? And if she would charge them more, why would that be? And why would the buyer, who used to be her employer, might have a higher willingness to pay? And what is the mechanism behind this? Would she give something back in return if she charges them higher? And how would that work? And so the kind of fundamental question behind, after thinking about the pricing, that the pricing part of this that we have, is whether these kind of what we call the professional tie between this individual and the buying organization provide any value. So to be clear, when we talk about professional ties in this paper, we are talking about the connection between this decision-making individual in the selling organization and the buyer organization. Now, why do we care about this, and how does it connect back to the literature? Well, the first literature that it contributes to is the literature on business-to-business marketing. So if you think about the B2B markets, the transactional value of these markets in the US is roughly the same as the transactional value of B2C, but less than 4% of papers published in top marketing journals are in the B2B context, and for very good reason, because it's very difficult to get data in these markets, transactional data in particular in these markets. And for many of these papers, the B2B papers, they talk a lot about the importance of relationships, business relationships in B2B markets, starting with some early works in the 90s and some even before that, that looked into trying to kind of measure the value of these professional relationships between the two institutions. But by and large, if you look at the literature in this area, for the most part, we really don't know much about the individuals who make decisions in these organizational relationships. So at the end of the day, in organizational relationships, people who make decisions are individuals, and we think it's important to try and think about what is the role of these individual decision makers in these organizational relationships. The other aspect that we think is important, and kind of the other element of the contribution of this work, is looking into pricing problems in these B2B markets. So as we know, pricing is one of the most important among the 4 Ps in the marketing mix variables. Pricing has the largest impact, arguably, on firms' financial standing. And yet in B2B context, it's grossly understudied. So we are trying to kind of contribute to that literature by trying to add one more kind of a variable that can explain partially how pricing works in these B2B markets. And we also contribute to the literature on social ties. So most of the literature on social ties is in B2C context, and for the most part, that literature focuses on the diffusion of information and influence. So if you look at social ties papers in B2C, most of them are about how word of mouth travels, how these kind of social ties influence, for example, diffusion of new products. If I'm Facebook friends with someone and they adopt the latest model of iPhone, how more likely would that make me to adopt the latest model, and so on. And what we do here is that we kind of bring that notion of social ties, or a certain form of that, into the context of B2B. And in this context, we look at how these kind of social ties can influence pricing. So in B2B contexts, unlike B2C contexts, where usually you have many sellers and many buyers, here both the supply side and the demand side are much more concentrated. There are fewer buyers and sellers, and so the notion of the importance of these kind of social ties, or professional ties as we call them, is not usually about the transfer of information. People know different sellers The importance comes in other forms that, as we'll see in our context, it's more in the form of sort of providing reliability and trust. And finally, the last reason we are very interested in this context is because of the particular market that we are going to study this problem in, and that is the repo market, which is a very important financial market. It was at the nexus of the last financial crisis. And I will explain some details of this market shortly. So if the problem that we are talking about is so important, the question is why people haven't looked at this before. And so among many reasons, one of the reasons is that there are very serious empirical challenges. The first one being it's very difficult to observe prices in B2B markets. In most B2B markets, when a buyer and a seller sign a contract, there are explicit clauses in the contract that prevent either side from revealing prices to any third parties. So it's very difficult to get price data. Even more difficult is getting access to information about these individual decision makers and their social ties. In fact, if you think about the jobs of sales reps, part of the job of the salespeople usually is to figure out who is the decision maker in the client organization, who makes the final calls. And so, let alone for the researcher, how hard it would be for researchers to figure out who decision makers are. Another reason, or another reason that people haven't really looked into this, or they found usually it's difficult to study these problems, is that in B2B markets, usually products are tailored in every transaction. And think about the context like the context of construction contractors. Every project is different compared to the last. And what that means is that when you see price variations, it's very difficult to pin down, is it because the products are different, or is it because of some other elements, for example, social ties of people who are making decisions on buyer and the seller side. And finally, like many other contexts, in this context, it is also the case that the formation of social ties is usually endogenous, making it hard to disentangle their effects from other potential unobservable factors. So keeping these challenges in mind, let me talk a little bit about the particular market that we are going to try to answer our questions in its context. And that is the repo market. Repo market is a market for short-term liquidity or cash for large institutions. Usually you have 2 or 3 parties. In the particular context that we study, it is a 3-party kind of context. We usually have a buyer or a borrower, which is an organization, usually a large bank, who owns securities and needs cash. You have a seller or a lender, another organization, usually a money market fund, who owns cash and wants to lend it out and get some interest on it. And so the price in this market, so the commodity of exchange is cash, and the price in this market is the interest rate, basically. And then there is a third party, which in all these transactions, it is the same bank, the Bank of New York Mellon, who facilitates the transactions and holds on to the securities that are being used as collateral in these exchanges. The interesting, or one of the very interesting and intriguing things about this market is that the transactional value of this market is $2 trillion a day, out of which $450 billion a day is the tri-party repo, the part that we focus on. And the first time that my co-author told me it is a $2 trillion per day transactional value, I thought I heard it wrong. It was like, you mean $2 billion a day, right? And she was like, no, $2 trillion a day. It's roughly 8% of the US GDP changes hands every day in this market. And the reason it is so large is because it basically is the market that fuels the whole US financial system. So again, we kind of focus on this $450 billion tri-party section of the market for reasons that I will explain shortly. And so to kind of be clear on how this market works, in this market, we usually have a buyer and a seller. On the buyer side, the decision maker is a repo trader or the manager for the repo trading desk. On the seller side, you have a portfolio manager who makes decisions about which rate to work with and sometimes the volume. And then the way it works is that the buyer and the seller agree on a certain price. It usually happens very early in the morning. So keep in mind, this is the market that provides liquidity for day-to-day workings of the whole financial system. So before the markets opens, usually very early in the morning, 7 a.m. Eastern time. If you are a financial institution in California, you have to get up at 4 a.m. to trade in this market. Deals start, and in a very short period of time, the whole market clears. So most of the market is cleared by 8:30, and almost the whole market is cleared for the day by 10 a.m. Eastern time.
Naveen,
yeah.
One question. Does that mean that the bargaining imply that the bargaining is indeed very limited in this market? Do I understand that right?
Yeah. So to understand it well, this is a very, very high frequency kind of market. We are dealing with each other every day. So the way to think about it is that for most days, we kind of follow what the market says, right? We kind of know every day we deal with each other $2 trillion at like 1% or 50 basis points or whatever we are dealing with. And there are going to be episodes where there is a huge shock in the market. You text me on my Bloomberg terminal, hey, Naveen, I need $2 billion more today. And then that there might be some more kind of going back and forth between us.
Okay, cool.
So in this context, then we are trying to study this problem. And then the question is, okay, why did we pick such a particular context to study the questions that we are studying? For a few reasons. The first, they are like any other financial market. People are very meticulous about recording all the details of the transactions. We have a lower level of complexity of performance and also the object of the transaction, because the transaction is about cash. So it is a fungible commodity that kind of is harder to get more commodity than cash. And then we have access to transactional data through mandatory disclosure of information to the Federal Reserve System. So anyone who deals in this market has to reveal their transactions to the Fed. And we have a well-recorded history of transactions, and we also have access to professional information of decision makers in this market. And finally, because this is a $2 trillion a day market, this is a very important market to look at. And we do have some exogenous shocks that we can leverage to answer our questions. So in terms of data, we have transactional data between 2014 and 2019. We observe rates, volume, collateral type, identities of the buyer and the seller. And as I said, we focus on transactions with overnight maturity. And the raw data includes transactions by each fund within a money market fund complex, but we aggregate everything at the complex level, because in this market, it seems like the demand for cash or for what they call the balance sheet securities on both sides is aggregated at the organizational level, and the transactions go through a repo trading desk in each organization. And then we kind of collapse the transaction data to buyer-seller day level. So the unit of observation in our analysis would be a buyer-seller pair per day. So some summary statistics here. We have 29 buyers, 45 sellers, more than 500 buyer-seller pairs. And each seller usually on a daily basis deals with 7 buying partners, and each buyer deals with 8 selling partners. The average price is 1.1%, and the average volume of a transaction is about $1 billion. So that's about the transactional data. Now the question is, how do we deal with the professional ties data, and where do we get this? So what we need to do here is that first we need to identify who is the individual decision maker at every seller organization. And then after that, we need to figure out whether that individual decision maker is an ex-employee of any of the buyers in this market, right? And the way we do it is that to identify who these individual decision makers are, we're going to use these SEC filings called NMFE filings that each of these money market funds have to submit to the Securities Exchange Commission on a monthly basis, and kind of use the information there to figure out who is the decision maker on the seller side. And we verify that they are indeed the portfolio managers. And then we kind of use the LinkedIn data to find the profile of each of these sellers and kind of put together their resumes. For some of them that we can't find the LinkedIn profile for, we use Capital IQ or Bloomberg profiles. And we kind of put together their resumes and check to see who used to work for any of these buyers in this market. So in total, we have 163 individual decision makers who work at the sellers. 108 of them have never worked for any buyers before. And from the 55 IDMs who have worked for a borrower or a buyer, 20 of them have a professional tie, meaning they are going to be in decision-making positions when that particular seller deals with a buyer who is that IDM's ex-employer, right? So taking a look at some summary stats for these individuals, one point that I want to kind of make more salient is that on average, these people, between the time that they leave the buying organization and before they start working for a seller, there is a 6 years lag on average. So they usually go work for some other organizations before they land the seller organization. And it's kind of the reason I highlight this is that it will become clear when I talk about addressing endogeneity issues. But let's go back to the empirical challenges that I mentioned. So we talked about 4 empirical challenges. One was the prices are not observed. Here we use proprietary data. The second one, IDMs are not observed. I mentioned that we use SEC filings and LinkedIn data to kind of figure out who IDMs are and what their professional ties are. But there are 2 remaining issues. One is the variation in B2B prices being attributed to unobservable factors about change of product or service. And the last one, this issue of potential endogeneity for formation of ties when we think about professional ties or social ties more broadly. So about the first one, the ambiguity or the heterogeneity of the commodity of exchange. So here, considering this particular market, we have complete product homogeneity. The commodity of exchange is cash. There is no counterparty risk because we have a third party, Bank of New York Mellon, which is the same across all transactions. So it nearly eliminates any counterparty risk. There is no duration risk because we are talking about overnight maturity trades. No collateral risk because all the collaterals used in this market are treasury securities. And we have a panel data which allows us to control for the history of transactions and exchanges between buyers and sellers over time. So how about the endogeneity issue. So there are a few concerns about endogeneity that come to mind that we have to think about. The first thing is the potential endogeneity in movement of labors, of movement of these decision makers. So the issue is that could it be the case that, let's say there is an unobserved factor, we call it the strength of commercial ties between buyers and sellers, and the stronger the commercial ties between these buyers and sellers, the more likely that someone from the buyer could move to the seller organization. Could that be the case? And we argue that for a few reasons that's not a cause for concern. First, note that, as I mentioned, on average, there's 6 years after someone leaves the buyer before starting to work for the seller. And the other important point is the fact that the identification for us comes from variation in professional ties over time, which I'll explain in a second. The other potential endogeneity issue is that what if the whole effect that we could find is about strong commercial relations and not professional ties. So even before thinking about the endogeneity of movement, it could be the case that, again, there is an unobserved factor that kind of affects both the strength of the commercial ties between the two institutions and the likelihood of having a professional tie. And so if you think about the way we are identifying this effect, so think about a particular seller dealing with a bunch of buyers. Here, seller S is dealing with 4 different buyers, right? And over time, we see changes in the individual decision maker. So at the beginning, we have the first individual decision maker. This individual decision maker does not have any professional ties with any of the buyers. So she hasn't worked for any of the buyers before. After that, another decision maker replaces the first one. She used to work for B1. So here we consider that between the time T1 and T2, there is a professional tie between S and B1. Then after T2, another individual decision maker replaces the last one, IDM3 comes in, and she used to work for B5, but seller S does not deal with B5. And so we have done some robustness checks. We show that the professional ties of individual decision makers does not affect the likelihood of dealing or trading between buyers and sellers. And then after a while, IDM3 moves out, IDM4 comes in. She used to work for B2, so there's going to be a professional tie between S and B2 for the duration that IDM4 works as the decision maker, right? And so on. So if you really think about this context, what is really identifying our effect is the changes in the professional tie between buyers and sellers as different decision makers, individual decision makers, move in and out of decision-making positions, right? If it were the case that it's about an unobserved strength of the commercial relations, then that would already be captured if we can control for the buyer-seller exchanges through fixed effects. Those fixed effects would control for the strength of those relationships. And so what really identifies our effect is this kind of intertemporal changes. You could also think that it could be the case that the strength of those relationships also could change over time. That sometimes the relationships are stronger between the buyer and the seller, and sometimes they get weaker. And what if there is a correlation or co-movement between the two? When S and B1 have a strong relationship, commercial relationship, S appoints a decision maker who has a strong tie with B1. And so there could be some co-movement over time that even if we have buyer-seller fixed effects, for example, we cannot account for that. But in this context, it's important to note that each of the buyers make up less than 10%, a fairly small share of the seller's business, almost by construction, because for risk control purposes, the seller doesn't want to have more than a certain, doesn't want any buyer to have more than a certain share of its business. And so, and also in the interviews that we had with people who work in the industry, they mentioned usually it's not, they don't think about the ex-employment of people who put in these decision-making positions. So, okay, having that in mind, keeping that in mind, here is how we set the our empirical specification. So we're gonna have a daily panel regression for the duration of the data for price of buyer I and seller J on day T. And we are going to regress that on the professional tie status between the buyer and seller at that time. And we are going to add a few control variables that can move over time. But more importantly, we are going to have buyer fixed effects, we are going to have seller fixed effects, and then we are going to have buyer seller fixed effects. So and also time fixed effects. So we are going to try to really absorb any effects that could come from the specifics of the market and movement in the market over time, and also the specifics of any particular buyer-seller relationship. And we also are going to have a bunch of controls based on the organizational characteristics of both the buyer and the seller. So here is our main effect. Running this regression, what we find, looking at the first row, the coefficient on professional ties is positive and significant. Now, if you think about the size of these estimates, they are tiny. It's like 25 basis points, relatively 25 basis points. And the interesting thing about this is that the first that I looked at these coefficients, I thought these are tiny. This is a very, very small effect. And then my co-author, who is in finance, she thought, oh my God, these are massive, massive effects. And so we have this kind of interesting reaction that most of the time when you present this for finance audience, they think this is a very large effect. When you present it for marketing audience, they usually sometimes comment, oh, but these are very small numbers. But I want you to think about the size of the market and size of these deals. So these are average $1 billion deals, and the size of the transactions in this whole market is $2 trillion a day. So tiny changes in the interest rate can have massive implications in terms of the revenue, and more broadly in terms of the impact on the whole market. So looking at this, the next question that we had was, okay, what is the mechanism? Why do we see this? Why is it the case that if I know you, or if you used to work for my organization and now you're on the other side of the table and you're selling me something, I'm going to be willing to pay more? And we thought about 3 different mechanisms. The first one was this notion of reliability premium. In most B2B markets, it's very important for buyers to have access to reliable supplies. And this market is no exception. It's very important for banks, for organizations on the buying side of this market to have reliable access to cash or liquidity to fund their daily operations. And so one sort of mechanism that came to mind was, well, most of the time this market is very kind of going steadily, and then there are going to be episodes where there is going to be some turbulence in the market. Maybe there is not enough supply of cash, and so it's going to be harder to get enough cash to fund your operations, and maybe in return, a familiar seller would come through and help you out when you need more cash and the supply is short in the market. The other mechanism that we thought about was this notion of information premium. And the idea here was that it could be the case that IDMs, these individual decision makers that have worked for some of these buyers, do have more information about the buying organization that they used to work for. And therefore, during these bargainings and negotiations, they can leverage that to charge higher. So what we do here, we use the number of years that an individual decision maker worked for a buyer as a proxy for that IDM's information about the buying organization. And finally, we thought about another potential mechanism, which we call it internal signaling mechanisms. This idea that an IDM at the seller maybe wants to signal something to her management or to her colleagues about her skills, or about the fact that she doesn't do any favoritism. So she charges organizations that she used to work for higher. And here we use the number of years that that decision maker works for the seller as a proxy for being less likely to need to signal internally. Because we know from the literature, the longer you work for an organization, the more confident you will be and the less need you will feel to signal. So I'm going to focus mostly on the first one. So to test this reliability premium mechanism, what we do is that we use a kind of an anomaly in the market. During September 16 and 17 of 2019, there was a stress episode in the repo market where prices jumped up. There was not enough supply of cash in the market. And on September 17th, in particular, the average rate in the tri-party repo market more than doubled. While volumes, so this is a kind of because you are trying to supply enough cash for your operations, volumes don't change as much in this market usually. So we are going to use this, we're going to leverage this, trying to see whether this reliability mechanism has any merits. And the idea is that if that is the case, then in a stress episode like this, we should see more money changing hands. We should see more volume in the transaction between the buyers and sellers that do have a professional tie. So if you regress the log of volume of transactions between buyers and sellers, and on the right-hand side, have an interaction between the professional tie status of the buyer and seller, and a dummy variable for that stress episode, September 16th and 17th, we get a positive and significant effect. So what this tells us is that during that stress episode, indeed, sellers who used to work for the buyer organization are willing to lend them more money. And somewhat kind of helping them out when there is not enough supply in the market. However, keep in mind, what we have shown is not really a reliability premium. What we are showing is kind of two separate things, right? We show that if the seller used to work for the buyer, if there is a professional tie, the seller charges the buyer more. On the other hand, when the market is in short of cash, the seller is willing to provide more cash, right? But it's really, the link between the two is not really clear. So what we did was we kind of went and talked to a bunch of people who worked in this market. And through these interviews, we tried to kind of understand what is their perspective and does this look familiar? What do they think about this? So I'm going to provide a couple of quotes from them. The first one, this is from a repo trading desk manager, talking about what matters in these markets. He says in the repo market, particularly after the financial crisis, it is all about consistency. If you know someone, you can trust them to be more consistent, which goes back to this notion that on a daily basis, you are funding your whole operation. You want to make sure you have access to enough supply. But kind of my favorite quote is from a funding markets research analyst from Deutsche Bank. And I kind of explained what we found in our data, and asked him to make sense of it. And here's what he said. He said, the reason buyers pay more to sellers they know is that they are taking on an option that is not enforceable. You would do that only if you trust the other side. It's like if you buy home insurance without a formal contract, you want to know if your basement floods, you can trust the seller and exercise that option. So his basic idea about this is that, look, the reason this happens is that basically I'm paying forward because I want you to help me out when I don't have access to enough supplies. And I could do that because we don't have a formal contract. I could do that only if I can trust you. And that professional tie provides that. So to test this further, we thought, okay, if that is the case, then maybe we can test that by looking at a different part of this market. And that's the market for longer term loans for these funding contracts. There are these funding contracts called evergreen trades. And these are longer term trade deals as opposed to overnight deals that we use for our main analysis. And under these deals, a buyer and a seller commit to a trade for a certain volume, but the prices could change. So if you are a buyer, you could have certain funding needs, and you might kind of negotiate with your, thank you, you could negotiate with your, you could negotiate with your seller that, look, for the next, however, 2 months, 3 months, we need to fund certain operations for $3 billion a day. So you kind of agree on that, but then prices can change depending on market conditions, right? And the basic idea is that because these trades are longer term, then they offer more supply reliability in more formally, because you kind of have a contract, right? It's kind of in that analyst's terminology, this one is enforceable because you have a contract, right? And so if reliability mechanism is at play, then we would expect to see that the importance of professional ties should diminish the longer the terms of the contract. So basically, if we interact our professional tie dummy variable with the length of these deals, we should find a negative coefficient. And so we use a separate data set for this. This is the data set on evergreen deals for which is a market which is a little smaller than the initial market. It's like more than $200 billion daily worth of transactions. And we based on, so we don't see the contracts themselves, but from how the volumes adjust and how prices adjust, we can come up with a proxy for the length of these contracts. And so what we do is that first we run this, our initial specification, we get the same result, but it's not as significant, and the coefficient on professional tie seems to be smaller, which is expected if indeed the reliability is at play. But the other aspect of this is that if on the third line, if you look at the interaction between professional tie and the length of these contracts, we get a negative and significant coefficient, suggesting that the longer the contracts are, from our perspective, the more reliable the supply is, the more certain you are you're going to get the cash you need for your operations, the less important the professional tie would be, which kind of is in line with this interpretation of, it's like a contract that is not enforceable. Therefore, you want to have that kind of supply reliability of supply contract with someone you know. So the other two elements the other two mechanisms that we looked at, one was the information premium mechanism, and the way we thought about this was that we said, okay, so if it is about the buyer having more information, the seller IDM having more information about the buyer, maybe we can proxy that level of information with how long that IDM has worked for the buyer and interact that with the professional tie. here we get marginally significant results, but the effect is very small and it's marginal. And finally, for testing our internal signaling mechanism, what we do is we kind of use the number of years that that individual decision maker worked at the seller as a proxy for the need to signal internally. And again, here we don't find kind of supporting evidence for this either. So I'm going to conclude here. So again, we looked at the study of professional ties in this particular B2B market, which allowed us to really kind of single out the effect of professional ties. And we showed that they do matter. And we found some evidence of a reliability premium in this market. But the 2 points that I want to highlight more is about the implications of this, more managerial and policy implications of our findings. So from a managerial perspective, if you think about our finding, basically what it says is that if you're managing a sales team, maybe it makes sense to take a look at the professional ties of people that you want to put on your team. If they have used to work for one of your key accounts, there might be some value that you could create, putting them in place of handling those accounts for both your organization and your client. And on the other hand, from a policy perspective, particularly that this is in the context of financial markets, in many of these financial markets, we care a lot about the way financial advisors deal or handle their fiduciary duties. And maybe we usually think about this in terms of conflict of interest, but maybe one of the other aspects that we should think about is also this notion that the past employment of these financial advisors with fiduciary duties do matter. Thank you so much. And I'm going to stop sharing so that our discussant can have the floor.
I wonder whether anyone has any questions. I mean, I can give like a couple minutes if anyone has a question for Naveen.
I do have a question, Naveen. It's just clarification, just in case I understand wrong. I still feel why the new professional ties times the length of the contract implies the reliability premium. Is it because based on I'm not an expert in this financial market, but what I would think if the contract is we need more time, then I will more want to rely on people I know. In case, for example, something happens in the long term, and then I'm afraid of the lack of money, then I'd like to find someone that I know. For example, if it's just one day, then maybe it's okay that if I'm short of this, then it's fine. Just clarify, because I do not know much about this market. Yeah.
That's a great question. So the way we think about it is that so the reason you use this market is because you want to fund your business, right? And you have an ongoing funding requirement, right? You know that every day you need $5 billion for a certain part of your business, right? The problem with this is that you don't know if tomorrow, so let's say I'm Morgan Chase, you are Vanguard. Every morning I text you on Bloomberg Terminal, I'm like, hey, we are good for that 5 billion for the same rate as yesterday, and you say yes, right? Imagine tomorrow morning I get up and you say, no, I'm not going to do that. The rates are higher, or I'm sorry, today I don't have that, right? That's going to cause a panic, because now I have all these people who rely on me on the repo trading desk to bring the money to do their daily business. So I care a lot about this consistency or reliability in the sense that I want to be sure that you are good for that 5 billion trading deal that we have every day, right? And so what these contracts do is that when we sign one of these, we are like, okay, we are going to do this for 3 months every day. But we are gonna, depending on the market, we might adjust the price, right? So in that sense, the longer that is, I will be less stressed. That it will be like, okay, I know, I'm gonna have access to that part of the cache, so I don't need to worry about that. We are kind of formalizing that I have to trust you that tomorrow you're gonna be there. We're gonna put that in contract in a sense.
I got it. It's basically like if it's one day market, I can make sure that the money is going to me, not like others. Then this relies on the reliability. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, I guess I need to start. 1 second. Hi, everyone. I'm Ying-Shi from UT Dallas, and I would say thank you to the conference organizer to giving me this paper to discuss, and Naveen did a wonderful job. Well, this is a Harvard style, high-powered and high-energy kind of presentation. I really enjoy reading this paper. So first, I'm personally interested in this professional tie, or sort of in the broader context. This is more about interpersonal relationship and social capital, social ties, the role of that in business transactions. And also this is about a market actually I'm less familiar with, is B2B. So this is like very interesting kind of a new context for me. The research question here is about how professional ties might influence the pricing decision and might provide value in the B2B market. There are many reasons. This is like a very interesting question. First, I think Naveen actually gave us all this like justification, like why this is a great gap in the literature. And we study a lot about the social capital, peer influence, interpersonal relationships, social ties, but all in the context of B2C. Despite B2B is like a very important context, we don't have much research in this, a bunch of reasons for that, and that directly lead to the choice of this particular empirical context, the repurchase market. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to go straight to the point about this particular empirical context. Some of the questions we got during the presentation, I would say, is also about, this is a new context as a marketing audience. We actually don't know some of the, kind of details about this market. So let's see what this market offers. So this is, I'm just taking this flow chart from the paper. This is the trade-party repurchase market, repo market looks like. What we do know about this market is first, it's a homogeneous market. We have this uniform product, the cash, to change hands. And we know this is a very safe transaction. So there's a minimal risk involved in this market. So all of this are very important why this become a very ideal context study, the research question. And another thing we know about this is because of this required disclosure that we know sellers' independent decision makers' identity can be identified, can be observed. And also, I think Naveen gave a very good explanation why this can be considered as exogenous variation in this temporary variation of professional tie status. So next, I want to say something like I feel it's not entirely clear in the current paper. So hopefully maybe further when the authors revise this paper, this might be something that useful to elaborate a little bit more, especially if this paper is targeting to a marketing audience. Some of these questions might totally become like irrelevant or already very familiar to finance audience. But for me, I mean, as a typical marketing person, I feel these are some things that I keep wondering even after reading the paper. So first, like what's the buyer and the seller's objective? I mean, I know price is the important decision here, but we also mentioned about consistency, whether if I want to borrow, I can reliably rely on you to supply enough volume to me. So if that's the objective, that should be kind of somewhat be included in the analysis. So it's not like pricing is not the only thing that we care about. And also in this flow chart, we know the step one starts from agree upon the price and amount, but who actually initiates the trade? Is a seller seeking for buyer after laying out, this is so much cash I want to lend out, and this is the amount I can lend out, and then the buyer also specify the terms like how much cash I want to I want to finance my transactions and at what rate. So I want to know a little bit more about the process before this step one take place. Whether there's any negotiation bargaining involved, I think during the presentation, Naveen did say there's a minimal negotiation bargaining involved. But then there are some, so basically maybe the buyer might look at the multiple sellers, the seller might be looking at the multiple buyers. So I just want to understand the whole process a little bit more to probably better appreciate the empirical strategy. And another point is about the only successful trade is recorded. This is related to negotiation bargaining. So should we worry about some sort of survival bias that the seller only selects certain buyers to trade with, and some of these negotiations might not go through? So do we want to worry about this might be some survival selection bias involved, and that might influence our interpretation of the result? And then lastly is about the role of decision maker. If it's a very fast decision, this is for overnight long, and probably it's a very fast decision process. How exactly can an individual, like a portfolio manager, influence the process? So is that mostly just aided by machine, and then the individual decision maker just take a last look, approve the transaction? So how exactly is that process? I mean, these are some of the things I feel if we know more, then probably we can understand the whole process better. Okay, the empirical strategy, I think the authors have done a very careful job to control the fixed effect, buyer-seller pair, fixed effect, buyer and seller fixed effect. Also, they control a bunch of these time-varying control variables, buyer-specific, seller-specific, buyer and seller relationship-specific variables. These are really very good. But one thing I'm just wondering, suppose this volume IJT is also one thing, like suppose a buyer have a certain volume they want to finance for a particular day. And for different sellers, they want to get a price quote for certain volume they want to borrow from that seller. I mean, if repo trade volume and price with a particular seller are co-determined, do we want to worry about this simultaneous bias? I mean, would that introduce some kind of bias to the result? So this is one thing I hope the authors can probably, give a little bit better explanation or justification in the paper. The mechanism, I mean, this is the part I really like. I mean, the result is like a 20 to 25 basis point price premium associated with a professional tie between buyer and seller. Naveen just explained this is actually a very big effect. And they actually went ahead trying to explain what might be causing this, very big effect. So this is the thing I like about this paper. They actually went the extra miles to find out what might be the mechanism to drive this effect. So they actually designed, based on each of the mechanism, they designed, a moderator kind of test to test the reliability premium, information premium, and internal signal hypothesis. So given the interest of time, so I'm just going to jump straight to some of the suggestions I have. So the first one is really what I already talked about before. For marketing audience, I feel like we could benefit a little bit more from a more in-depth discussion about the repo transaction process, whether the objective risk involves something rather than just the price alone. So then actually the price premium itself might be associated with like the cost in some other dimensions. I mean, consistency, reliability, or maybe this volume, the security. So I just want a more explanation of these general objectives and risks, and also the process, especially the role played by individual decision making in this process. What do they exactly do in that process? And the mechanism. So one thing I want to know actually sort of like think a little bit more about this reliability premium hypothesis. How would a professional tie, if someone worked at the buyer side before, really enhance this mutual trust? I think in the presentation become a little bit clearer through those two quotes and this additional task, which is not included in the current paper. That's the evergreen type of contract that task. But still, I want to know, I think, more about what exactly, how, like, I know someone. It's basically, are we talking about the social capital, social reputation of that individual decision maker? Their reputation is at risk here. Although it's not enforceable, but because of this repeat transaction and everybody will deal with everybody, you know, sort of, you know, for extended period of time. So in a way, it's kind of enforceable in that future repeat transaction in that sense. So a little bit more explanation of that can be make the paper stronger. And also I wonder whether there will be some other signals or more formal signals or enforceable mechanism that can really enhance this trust. If those signals and mechanisms are in place, probably they should be a little, I think they're just more reliable than these like kind of and not enforceable signals than professional ties. So I think the paper can really benefit a little bit more in-depth discussion of how this real reliability premium might work, and then how exactly the professional tie can signal this reliability. Another comment I have is about the information premium hypothesis. So a number of years, the individual decision maker work at the buyer can also be a proxy for the decision maker's social capital with the buyer. So in that sense, it's not really, I think, just information. It could be social capital and the personal relationship. So that might be a signal of the trust, the mutual trust too. So in that sense, I'm not too sure whether this is only kind of one task for information premium. Probably can also lend some support for the reliability premium hypothesis here. I also want to point out that 3 base point, although it's a marginal effect, is statistically, I think, marginally significant. But it's 3 point considering each of the DM who has this professional tie on average has 7.1 years of work experience of the buyer. So that actually translates into a 20 basis point, you know, depends on how long they work at the buyer side. So I actually think that effect is economically is actually a very strong effect. So I think and the other kind of thoughts I have is just like thinking about these 2 financial institutions and doing probably trades in a much broader context. Maybe there's some reciprocity in the broader market might give rise for these like professional tie, because I know you, I transact more with you. So then I hire the people who used to work with you, and then hopefully that, you know, in some other areas we do trades and then you can return the favor. I don't know whether there is any way to test that. Just some thoughts just to throw out there, just for, you know, kind of food for thought. Okay, additional checks, I don't have time, but very quickly, if reliability is less of a concern, then maybe we can use the data before the financial crisis to see whether professional tie is less of effect there. So that's another way to check whether this reliability is really the mechanism at work. And then I was just wondering, this is about the role of decision maker. So if the portfolio manager actually manages the whole portfolio, but the fund manager is actually the one who executed the trade. So in that sense, isn't that the professional tie at the fund manager level is the one who are going to make a difference in that actual trade process? I mean, so is that any task we can do, I mean, by check the robustness result using professional tie at the fund manager level? And also the recency of the DM's employment with the buyer might also kind of trade as like how recent knowledge, how much knowledge they have about, you know, the more recent they employ, they probably the more recent ties and the more recent kind of knowledge base they have or expertise they have with the buyer. So maybe that can also, we can construct a variable to test some of the mechanism using the recency of the employment too. Okay, in general,
Ying, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Hassan and Tolan are waiting in the other room for the keynote. So if you could.
Yeah, so this last slide.
Okay.
Okay. Very interesting paper, and this is very unique B2B transaction setting and important marketing and policy implications. So I think the marketing audience, if this paper is tackling towards marketing audience, can really benefit for a little bit more in-depth discussion about this traditional setup, the repurchase market. I really enjoyed the paper, and Okay, so I guess everybody now need to go to room 1.
Thank you so much,
our-
Ying. This is super, super helpful. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for great
Thank you.
discussion.
Yeah, I
See
think
you
we
all
can
in room
start.
1.
I requested Dean Perkul to actually give all the participants a welcoming address. So over to Dean Perkul. The others should be joining in a second or so. So we can start.
Thank you, Naveen. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome everyone to the conference. I was thinking about what to say, how to welcome you